the North Sea. He, along with 11 other divers, had just started a 4-week-long saturation shift. On the 12th of that month, Chris, along with 2 other divers named Dave and Duncan, were scheduled to perform routine maintenance on an oil platform 330 feet below the surface. The North Sea is notorious for terrible weather, but this day the weather was especially bad, and they considered not doing the dive, but ultimately they decided to do it anyways. As Chris, Dave, and Duncan put on their diving equipment and climbed from their living chamber through the tunnel into the dive bell, the captain of the ship navigated directly over this oil platform and then flipped on autopilot mode, which activated dynamic positioning. Now, dive ships rely heavily on dynamic positioning, which is really just this high-tech computer that makes sure as soon as you turn it on that the ship does not move from a particular spot in the water. So regardless of the swells and the wind, the ship stays steady. And this is really important when you have divers in the water because the dive bell is connected to the ship and the divers are connected to the dive bell. And so if the ship is moving all over the place, so is the dive bell, and so are the divers, making it impossible for the divers to do their job. Once the captain had the dynamic positioning up and running, the 3 divers sealed the door of the dive bell behind them, and then the dive bell was detached from the chamber and then lowered through a hole in the middle of the ship into the ocean. Once the bell got down to 330 feet, Chris opened up a hatch on the bottom of the dive bell that led directly into the water. Now, because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure outside the bell, water does not come in through this hole. Duncan was the bellman for the night, so he would not be going out and doing any diving. He would be staying in the bell to support Dave and Chris. And so he helped them get their big helmets on and connected their umbilical to each of them. Sat divers, when they're outside of the bell, are completely reliant on their umbilical. It's this long stretch of tubes and wires that are connected directly to their suit and to their helmet, and it provides air as well as heat and electricity to their lights, and it provides radio communication up to the people on the boat. Once Chris and Dave were all set up, they slipped through the hole at the bottom of the bell, which brought them down to this little platform that was suspended right below the bell, and from there they leapt off all the way down to the sea floor. Now, sat divers will say that leap from that platform is both amazing and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong on the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting in the rough seas, dragging with it the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped on the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice that this was no drill, this was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. They needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up to the bell. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilical was getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top, and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, "There is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free." And Chris would say, I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon. And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off, and what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on. However, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware that even if they're looking for him, they're not going to find him in time. He's going to die. And at some point, breathing would have become extremely difficult until there was no more air, and then he would have passed out and keeled over. Back on the surface, the captain was desperately trying to use manual controls to pilot the ship back over where Chris was, but because of how rough the seas were, it was proving to be nearly impossible. As the captain struggled, other members of the crew launched a remote-controlled vehicle into the water to at least go down and try to find Chris. And so they decided they would just pilot straight to the underwater structure and begin looking around that area. And so for a few anxious minutes, the crew on board the ship watched the camera, which was the live feed coming from this underwater vehicle, as it went through totally dark water. And then at some point on the screen, the structure just appeared, and the vehicle, as it went up towards the top, it got a look at the very top of the structure. And on the screen, they saw Chris lying on his side, totally motionless. At this point, he had been without air for at least 20 minutes. In a last-ditch effort, the captain decided to completely power off the ship and its computer and just do a hard reset, something that you would never do, especially in rough seas, because if it doesn't come back on again, you are dead in the water. But when they turned it back on again, the ship came on and the computer system came back online, including the dynamic positioning computer. And so the captain immediately threw it on autopilot and the ship navigated right over where Chris's last position was. After Chris's umbilical had broken, Dave had managed to climb back up to the bell, and he was just standing underneath that platform right beneath it. And so when the ship got right back over Chris's position, Dave leapt off the platform, got to the seafloor, climbed up the structure, grabbed hold of Chris's body, and hauled him back up into the bell. Once Chris's body was inside the bell, Duncan, the bellman, removed Chris's helmet, and he saw that his face was blue and he was totally lifeless. But Duncan immediately just gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And after giving him 2 big breaths, Chris came back to life. He started gagging and coughing, and he's looking around wide-eyed, and Duncan and Dave are looking at him like, you gotta be kidding me, you're supposed to be dead. And after about 30 seconds, the color in Chris's face had totally come back, and he was looking at Duncan and Dave and asked them, what happened? And Duncan and Dave didn't have an answer for him. And so instead, all 3 men just started laughing and hugging. They could not believe it. Once Chris was brought back up to the ship, the dive medic looked at him and concluded that nothing was wrong with him. He was perfectly fine, despite the fact he had been without an air supply for over 30 minutes. And 3 weeks after the incident, Chris was back down saturation diving again. Today, scientists don't know how Chris survived. The leading theory is that it was just so cold, it slowed his heart and his brain down, and that somehow kept him alive. But the reality is, his survival is a total mystery. Here is what the crew saw when their remote-controlled vehicle found Chris lying on top of that platform. 7-year-old Bruce Farron, along with his aunt, uncle, and cousins, began the 2-mile hike into the Uinta mountain range in Utah. They were headed for Pyramid Lake, where they planned to do some camping for a couple of days. After they arrived, they decided they would head down to the water to cool off. But right before they got in the water, Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom. And so his family got into the water, and Bruce walked over to a grove of trees and bushes to relieve himself. After a couple of minutes, Bruce did not come out of the wood line, and so his aunt and uncle started yelling for him. He didn't come out again, and so the uncle walked up and walked into the trees to go find his nephew, but he was not there. And so his uncle starts yelling for his nephew, but he's nowhere to be found. And so he yelled back for his wife and his kids to come help him look. And for the next hour, they searched the entire area yelling for Bruce, but there was no sign of him. So they contacted the authorities. That day, a huge search was launched for Bruce, but just like his family, nobody could find any trace of him. The following day at 4 p.m., Bruce had still not been located. And at this point, his family is starting to lose hope. And it was around that time that a searcher who was several miles away from where Bruce had last been seen was walking up this very steep trail heading up towards this cliff. And the searcher knew this cliff was 500 feet and there was no way a child could climb up it or down it. And so he was about to turn around and go search somewhere else when he happened to look up and he saw a child walking down the trail towards him. And the child was Bruce. And Bruce was totally fine, albeit a little bit hungry. According to David Paulides, all of these search and rescue models that predict where missing people will end up after they go missing say that boys aged 7 to 9 will be found within a 7.2 mile radius 95% of the time, and that distance could be covered over a week's time. In order for Bruce to be found where he would have needed to cover 20 miles along a rugged ridgeline before scaling down that 500-foot cliff without the aid of climbing gear, and he did all that within 30 hours, a seemingly impossible task for a missing 7-year-old boy. When asked what happened, Bruce said he didn't remember. He didn't understand why or how he had gotten lost in the first place. The only things he remembered were sleeping between 2 downed logs and drinking from a waterfall and many animals, including one that was so close to him at night that it would jump over him. Bruce was followed up with as he got older, but he never could regain the memory of what actually happened to him. Some have speculated that Bruce might have been abducted when he went to the bathroom, and that's the only way he was able to cover that great of a distance in that amount of time, that his abductor basically physically moved him at least part of the way, and that perhaps his abductor was one of these animals he saw. In 2004, 49-year-old Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming, bound for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. They were planning to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe. And Robert and his family were members of the Crow Reservation and therefore had the rights to hunt on that land. The specific spot the boys were going to be hunting was Black Canyon, a particularly steep and rugged area. But Robert was well equipped for this type of environment because he had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their Special Operations Unit, which would have meant he would have received a very high level of outdoor survival training, which is perfect for living up in the mountains. Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from him and were very competent outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reserve on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan was the 2 boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon and attempt to drive elk down into the valley so their dad could take a shot at them. But late in the afternoon, the 2 teenage boys had not seen a single elk, and so it was getting to be time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot, and so they packed up their stuff and they headed there. The boys make it to the meeting area and their father, Robert, is not there. So they sit down and they begin to wait. And an hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by, still no sign of their dad. They can't get in touch with him. They have no cell phone service. And so they're thinking to themselves, okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around and he'll have to spend the night out in the cold. But he's got warm winter clothes on. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. And so as the sun was setting, the boys did finally leave to go tell authorities that their dad was, lost in Black Canyon somewhere. But it was just not registering for them that this could be life-threatening, that something really bad could have happened to their dad. He was just this Superman figure to them, and it just did not cross their mind. Authorities launch a search that night that includes the use of helicopters with thermal imagers doing low flyovers of the entirety of Black Canyon. Thermal imagers pick up a heat signature, and so anyone that is alive gives off a heat signature. And so at night, if you were flying overhead and you saw a person in the middle of a canyon where there's virtually nothing else around them, they would stand out like a bright light. But that night, the helicopters combed all over Black Canyon and they never saw Robert. However, authorities would say that, this guy, he's trained, former special operator, he probably went and found shelter. So he could be inside of a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter with tree branches, and it's obscuring him from the thermal imager, and so we'll just have to look tomorrow. But the next day, despite bringing out hundreds of searchers and bloodhounds and people on horseback and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was no sign of Robert. And after several weeks of still not finding any sign of Robert, they ultimately called it off. The family was obviously crushed, but more than that, they were just dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to invincible Robert, that just didn't add up for them. And so after the official search was terminated, they would continue to make trips into Black Canyon looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, like all the searchers, they never found any trace of him and eventually accepted that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter who didn't know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared, this hunter is in Black Canyon in the same area where Robert Springfield had disappeared. And this hunter is walking through this really dense forest. He's all alone, he's an experienced hunter, and he's not on a path, he's just kind of combing through the woods, and he starts to hear what sounds like a crow screeching. And at first, it doesn't really register with him. It's only in retrospect that he recalls this sequence of events. As he kept walking on, the screeching intensified to the point where he just could not ignore it. And so he stopped and turned to listen to this screeching crow that he couldn't see through the dense forest, but he could tell it was in that general direction. This hunter said as soon as he stopped and he turned and began actively listening to this crow, he had this weird sensation that the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange experience. He had never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he spent lots of time outdoors. And so he felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow. And so he starts walking towards the crow. He still can't see it. It's very thick vegetation, and he's getting closer and closer, and he gets to a place where he can just barely see this crow. It's in a clearing. There is this large tree stump right in the middle of the clearing, and this tree stump is not short. It's like 6, 7, 8 feet high in the air. It looks like this tree had broken in the middle and fallen over, and this crow is sitting on the top of this kind of gnarled stump. And the crow is just incessantly screeching. And from this hunter's perspective, he can see the crow and he's kind of staring at it. And as the hunter is looking at this crow, the crow suddenly turns and looks directly at the hunter. And it recognizes the hunter can see the crow, and the crow stops screeching and is just staring directly at the hunter. And this hunter would say he felt so unsettled by the sudden behavior of the crow, because it was almost like confirming the crow was looking for him, and now he had found him, and he stopped screeching and was looking at him. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter, to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the vegetation into the clearing to kind of confront the crow. And so he stepped into the clearing, and the crow the whole time is not screeching anymore, just looking at the hunter. And the hunter's standing in the clearing, and he looks at the crow, and the crow suddenly looks straight down. The hunter follows the crow's gaze down to the ground, and he sees at the base of the tree is a human skull. And the hunter's so taken aback by this, he looks back up at the crow, who's looking at him again, and the whole situation is so terrifying to this hunter that he just makes a note of where he is, and he runs. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in cell phone reception, he called authorities. Authorities showed up, and he showed them on the map where he had discovered this crow and this skull next to a tree. And sure enough, the authorities make their way out and they find the skull right under this tree. The crow at this point is gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it was not just a human skull, it was also a human femur bone right next to the skull. And then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed right next to them, neatly next to one another. And then next to that was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to the boots. And then next to that was a jacket that was not folded, but was balled up, and inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected, and they eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. And then they later recanted that statement and said, actually, he was hit by a falling tree. But if he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't it have been in that area? And then why were all of his things neatly stacked? Certainly he wouldn't have done that after getting hit by a tree, so who neatly stacked his things after he was hit? And then also, where is his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons would have heard the struggle because they were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? Also, where Robert's remains had been found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. And so it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid, meaning had he been under a tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking before the search was terminated. So the fact that he wasn't found means either hundreds of people didn't see him, including a helicopter with thermal imager, or he wasn't there until after the search was terminated. And if so, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by this hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to this tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe this hunter's story, and many, many people do, then do you really think it's a coincidence that all of this took place on Crow Reservation, home of the Crow tribe? I think not. But will we ever know the truth about what actually happened to Robert? I don't know. 8-year-old Corey Kelly contacted his good friend Jim Naprud to see if he wanted to go grouse hunting with him. Grouse are a type of game bird. Jim agreed, and the pair decided to meet at the Red Lake State Wildlife Management Area in Foretown, Minnesota, which was not far from where either of them lived. So the two men, along with Jim's dog named Sammy, arrive at the campsite on October 16th. They get out, they start setting up the campsite, putting the tent up, getting all their food laid out, and that's when Jim realizes they did not bring gasoline. So he says to Corey he's going to go into town and get some gasoline. Corey said he would stay back and continue setting up the campsite, maybe go out and get some firewood, and he would look after Sammy while Jim was gone. When Jim pulled away from the campsite, he turned and saw Corey carrying a shotgun with Sammy by his side walking into the woods. And so Jim assumed he must be heading into the woods to go grouse hunting. An hour and a half later, when Jim came back to the campsite, Corey and Sammy were gone. Now at first, Jim wasn't concerned at all. He figured Corey was still out grouse hunting and that he and Sammy would be back any minute. And so Jim hops out of his truck and he continues setting up camp. He goes out and gets some firewood. The whole time he's kind of looking around the woods, waiting for Corey and Sammy to, make a sound or show themselves, and they don't. And as the sun goes down, Jim's starting to feel a little bit more worried. And so he gets his phone out and he tries calling Corey, but the cell phone reception's so bad, he can't place a call. Jim knew Corey was extremely competent in the outdoors. He was an avid hunter, and he knew this area really, really well. However, he thought it is possible he could have gotten turned around while he was out grouse hunting, and so I should signal where the campsite is. And so for several hours, Jim honked his horn and flashed his truck's lights in hopes that Corey would see or hear him. Finally, after midnight, when Corey and Sammy had not returned, Jim decided, you know what, I'm psyching myself out. I'm sure they're fine. They'll be back in the morning. I don't know what happened, but I trust Corey can handle himself. So Jim falls asleep, and very early the next morning when he gets up, he's looking around hoping he's going to see Corey and Sammy. They're still not there, and so Jim begins to search the area himself. Jim walks 2 miles into this forest that's very thick, it's very swampy. He sees no sign of Corey or Sammy, and he's yelling for them. He's trying to call Corey on his phone, but there's no reception. And so he turned around and walked back to the campsite, now trying to dial 911, but even that wasn't going through. It was a total dead zone. And then luckily he saw some campers that were out near his campsite, and he asked them to try calling 911, and their call did go through. The police show up and they begin searching this forest, and they find almost right away that it's so difficult to walk in this forest because of how swampy and marshy it is that they have ATVs brought in just so they can do a basic search of the forest. And for 2 straight weeks, they looked everywhere in this forest for Corey and Sammy, and there was nothing, no sign of them. Then on October 25th, 9 miles away from where Jim and Corey's campsite was, 2 hunters found Sammy wandering around the forest. And she was hungry and dehydrated, but overall she was in good health. And so they tried to get her to track to wherever Corey was, but she wasn't doing it. At this point, the focus of the search was shifted to where Sammy was found, and they began searching that area, and 3 days later, they found Corey's cigarettes and his lighter. The following day, they found Corey's overalls, socks, and sweatshirts, now 14 miles from where Jim and Corey's campsite was. But even after finding all these things that belonged to Corey in a relatively small area, they looked and they couldn't find Corey. And then the weather started to get really bad, and it started to snow in the area, and they had to postpone the search. The search was started up again in mid-November, and they brought out all these scent-sniffing dogs, and they searched that area near where all his things were found for 13 more days. But again, they couldn't find anything. And then another wave of bad weather came in, and they had to postpone the search again, this time for the whole winter. They began looking for Corey for a third time the following year on April 28th by flying a plane over the area where all of his clothes had been found, and they were able to spot Corey's body. He was laying right in the middle of the swamp, right in the middle of the tall grass. It was determined he died of hypothermia on the first night he went missing, which means he had to have run a mind-boggling 14 miles through this forest before winding up in the swamp. And if you remember, on the very first search for him, the police were unable to just walk around the forest because of how swampy and wet it was. They had to bring in ATVs just to look around. And so the idea that Corey was able to run 14 miles in this swampy forest seemed impossible. In fact, that's what searchers said. It was impossible. Unless you were being pursued. If you think your life is in danger, you will do things that you cannot do unless your life is in danger. Adrenaline makes it that way. Lending credit to the idea he might have been pursued by someone or something is where he was found. He was found in the middle of the swamp, in the tall grass. There was a hard, packed path about 15 feet away from where he was found that he could have very easily gotten to. But he chose to be in the swamp, in the tall grass. So you got to ask yourself, if you were in Corey's position and you had the choice between standing in knee-deep water in the middle of a swamp in the tall grass where there are other dangerous predators in the swamp, or you can just stand on a path and be safe, which would you choose? Well, obviously you choose the path under normal conditions, but if you were trying to hide from someone, you might choose the tall grass. The last time Jim saw Corey, he was walking into the woods with Sammy carrying his shotgun. But when they found Corey in the marsh, there was no gun. And in fact, that gun was never recovered. But they did find an expended shotgun shell casing basically along the path they think Corey took to get to the marsh. He did have his cell phone on him, but from what I read, it looked like either he didn't use it or he just never had any service. Corey's death was ruled an accident, even though many people believe it's far more likely he was being pursued by someone or something, because it's just not normal human behavior to, in the middle of the night, get up and run 14 miles through a swamp. Up in southeastern Australia, Ricky McGee worked a variety of jobs, including being a carpet salesman, a prawn fisherman, a nightclub doorman, an electrician, and a bailiff. In 2006, when Ricky was 35, he was offered yet another new job in a government department in Western Australia. He accepted the job, hopped in his car, and began the long drive across the desert. While on the extremely desolate Bunteen Highway, which is basically a road in the middle of the desert with nothing around, no people, no buildings, nothing, he's driving along and he sees a group of 3 men standing outside of their car. And so Ricky assumed they must have broken down, so he pulls over to ask if they need help. And they come up to him and they're so gracious that he stopped, and they said, "We ran out of gas, can we hop in with you and ride up to the next town?" And Ricky says, "Fine, climb on in." So the 3 men, they get in his car and they take off. And then after that, Ricky has no memory. He thinks one of them drugged him by putting something in his drink, which was sitting in the center console and was open, but he doesn't know for sure. Ricky remembers waking up and he was in a camp and he sat up and he was unrestrained, and he looks out in front of him, and the 3 guys that had gotten in the car with him were sitting on rocks looking at him, and one of them had a gun that he was aiming at Ricky. And so Ricky's just looking around, not really sure what's going on, and one of them gets up and comes over and offers him water. Ricky takes a sip of the water because he's very thirsty, and Ricky believes the water was poisoned as well, because shortly after taking a sip, he passed out again. When Ricky regained consciousness a second time, he couldn't move. It was dark and he felt something tugging at his skin, and as he's laying there, he realizes there is black plastic right over his face. he's been buried. And then he realizes there is a dingo that is standing on his chest that has tugged the plastic away from his face because the dog is trying to take a bite out of Ricky, but the dog is the one that saved his life by creating an air pocket in the plastic. Ricky screamed at the dog panicked and leapt out of the hole and ran away, and Ricky was able to work his finger up to this hole and pull it all the way open and push himself out of the plastic, and he realized there wasn't much dirt or rocks that had been placed over him. They probably thought he would just suffocate in the middle of the desert and no one's going to find him anyways, but here he is. And so he stands up in his grave and he looks around and there's no sign of the three men. His car is gone. He realizes they also took all of his clothing, even his shoes. He's got no food. He's got no water. He's in the middle of the desert. There's no roads. There's no people. There's no buildings. There's nothing. At this point, confusion overtook Ricky because he just could not make sense of what had just happened to him. Who were these three people? Why'd they attack him? Did they just want to steal his car? Were they prepared to kill him to take his car? He couldn't understand it. And so there was some shade behind a little bush and he sat down in the shade and he just sat there for several hours thinking, what am I going to do? But not being one to let pessimism crowd his psyche, Ricky decides if he's going to survive, he needs to get up and get moving. After 10 days of just wandering through the desert and seeing nobody, he came across this fairly large water hole and he decided, I have a better chance of surviving if I just wait here until someone comes and rescues me than if I just keep walking through the desert where I'm bound to just eventually die. And so he makes a makeshift shelter next to this water hole and he begins to wait. After almost a week of being at the spot, Ricky had still not had a single thing to eat since this whole ordeal began. And so he's sitting there, his stomach is in knots, he's in so much pain, he's starving. And just then a lizard happened to run across in front of him, and without even thinking, he just reached out and grabbed it and took a bite out of it. And it was like all of a sudden this primal side of him was unleashed, and suddenly he had no issues eating anything that moved in the desert. For weeks, Ricky stayed at the spot drinking from the water hole and eating lizards, frogs, leeches, snakes, grasshoppers, caterpillars, basically anything that moved anywhere in the desert, he would chase it down and he would eat it. In fact, he developed an affinity for certain frogs over others, and he said in terms of eating leeches that they were okay, but you needed to eat them really, really quickly, otherwise they would attach to the insides of your mouth. Ricky also ate plants, but he would even say he had no idea what was harmful and what was okay to eat. He just ate what tasted good and got really lucky. But as much as Ricky was eating, it wasn't enough. He was slowly losing his battle with the desert and he was starving to death. And so Ricky believed he didn't have enough time to just continue to wait at this particular spot. He needed to go out and find help. And so he left that water hole and began stumbling through the desert all over again. But he was so weak, he only lasted for a couple of days before he found another water hole and he stopped there and he built yet another shelter, this time believing it would become his tomb. Over the next couple of days, wild dogs began coming to his camp and circling his camp. It was like they knew he was about to die soon, or they at least knew he was weak enough they could probably overpower him soon. At night, Ricky had to barricade the door of his shelter because the dogs would get aggressive and they'd come up to the door and try to paw their way inside. On the 70th day of his ordeal, Ricky believed he was probably within a day or two of passing away, and so he put a cross on the outside of his shelter, believing that would be his tomb, and at least this way someone might notice it and find his body, and then hopefully let his family know what happened to him. But on the 71st day, when Ricky happened to be standing outside of his shelter, two ranch hands happened to be way off the road in the outback and were looking in his direction, and they saw him. And when they went over to him, they said he looked like a walking skeleton, and Ricky practically collapsed as soon as he saw help had finally arrived. The ranch hands evacuated Ricky from the desert and brought him to a hospital where he weighed less than 100 pounds. At the beginning of his ordeal, he weighed over 230 pounds. Despite filing a report with the police about the three men who attacked him, they were never caught. Ricky checked himself out of the hospital after 6 days and made a full recovery. He ended up writing a book about his experience, and he now works construction in Dubai. Mauro Prosperi took part in the brutal Marathon des Sables, which is a 6-day endurance race covering 155 miles through the Sahara Desert. The competition was known as one of the toughest in the world, but Prosperi was a former Olympic athlete, and he kept himself in unbelievable physical shape. He was also a police officer back in Italy, which kept him even more active, so he felt ready. The competition's desert terrain was so dangerous that participants had to indicate where they wanted their bodies sent if they did not survive the race. In preparation for the race, Prosperi would run 25 miles a day day for weeks leading up to it, and he would give himself less and less water as he was running to get accustomed to dehydration. But despite how much he was training and his incredible athletic resume that showed he's someone that can probably do this, his wife was very concerned. But he would tell her, the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'll get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th, and initially it was going very smoothly. Prosperi was always at the front of the pack, and he was always the first Italian to finish that day's stage. And so when he would finish, he would go to his tent and he'd put an Italian flag on the outside to show the other Italians doing the race where they could find him to come inside and chat. And he would say that part of the race was really fun. Then things went wrong on the fourth day during the longest and most difficult phase of the race. When he set out that morning, it was already very windy, and he found himself in this section between these two big sand dunes, and the pace setters had already gone way ahead, so he's totally alone. And then out of nowhere, this massive sandstorm kicks up and completely blinds him. He can't go anywhere because he can't see where he's going, and so he manages to kind of feel his way to this rock, where he gets down behind this rock, and he thinks to himself, I'll just wait it out and then continue on. But the sandstorm raged for 8 hours. And when it was finally done, it was totally dark outside, so Prosperi couldn't see anything. So he decides, you know what, I'm gonna have to sleep on the dunes, and tomorrow morning I'll have to get up and keep going. And his biggest concern at this point was not that he was in a survival situation. It was, man, I was in 4th place in this race, and now with this huge setback, I'm probably gonna finish last. And so when he went to sleep that night, all he was thinking about is, man, I gotta get up and go as fast as I can so I don't finish last tomorrow. But when the sun came up the next morning, Prosperi looked around and he realized he had a much bigger problem. The sandstorm had been so strong, it had completely altered the landscape. The dunes had all moved around. He had no points of reference. And so even though he had a map and he had a compass, he had no way to orient himself, so he had no idea what direction to go. Anybody that competed in this race really needed to be self-sufficient, and so Prosperi had a knife, he had plenty of dehydrated food, he had a sleeping bag, but he had very little water. He had about a half bottle of water, because at each of the checkpoints during the day, the race officials would give you all of this water, and the idea was you would drink it all by the time you got to your next checkpoint. And he had not made it to the next checkpoint, and so was very low on water. As he's looking around, realizing this is a really bad situation, he thinks to himself, other runners must have had this same thing happen to them. They probably had to hunker down yesterday during the sandstorm, and they're just waking up now. They're looking around. I'm bound to find someone. We'll link up, and we will get to the end of this race, and we'll be just fine. And so he runs to the top of a sand dune and looks around, expecting to see someone. And he doesn't. There's no one in all directions. It's just completely barren desert. And so he leaves that sand dune, goes up another one, and does the same thing. He's looking around and there's nobody there. And over the course of several hours, he was just running to the peaks of these different sand dunes, expecting to see someone, not seeing anyone, becoming more panicked and expending more energy. And finally, by the late afternoon, when he's sweating profusely and the sun is bearing down on him and he still hasn't seen anyone, he realizes he's gonna die if he keeps doing this, and he needs to be smart about this. And so at this point, he went into survival mode, and he decided that the only times he's gonna move are gonna be at night and in the early morning hours, because those are the times when the sun is not up and it's still pretty cool, and he can conserve energy that way. He also began peeing into bottles and began conserving his urine to drink later when he did run out of water. And so over the next 2 days, he conserved his energy, but he was just kind of drifting through the desert and he wasn't really getting anywhere. He didn't know if he was making progress because he had nothing to go to. He wasn't seeing anyone, and he was starting to realize his situation is getting worse and worse by the minute. And then, in an incredible stroke of luck, he comes across this Muslim shrine in the middle of nowhere that Bedouins would use as they traveled across the desert, and he ran inside hoping that there'd be a person in there. And there was a person in there, but they were dead inside of a coffin. But he was happy that he now had shelter over his head, and this felt like progress. He began taking stock of his new surroundings, and when he was inside the shrine looking up into the ceiling, he saw it was lined with hundreds of bats. And at this point, he's really hungry, he's really thirsty, and so he climbed up into the rafters and began grabbing handfuls of bats and drinking their blood. After drinking the blood of 20 bats, he used some of the wood that was inside of the shrine, and he built a fire outside, and that would be his way to signal planes and helicopters going overhead that he assumed would be out looking for him. And so he sets the fire, and he comes back inside, expecting, over the next couple of days, someone's bound to find him, but nobody does. And 4 days go by, and 3 separate times a plane or a helicopter flew directly over him. He's got his fire going, he's out there flagging him down, but nobody saw him. And so at the end of those 4 days, he's now been out in the desert roaming around for nearly a week, and he's starting to realize that this is the end. He's not going to survive this. No one knows where he is. No one's seen him so far. He's running out of supplies. This is it. And so knowing he was staring down a long, painful death, either by dehydration or starvation, he decided he was going to expedite it. And he would say later that he did not feel sad about this. It just was a logical choice he was making. He figured this way, if he died inside of the shrine was more likely to be found than if he had died somewhere out in the desert where sand would cover him up. And so he said it was more likely people would find the shrine and therefore find him, and so there'd be closure for his family. And so Prosperi took a piece of charcoal from the fire, wrote a message to his wife, and then cut his wrists and laid down, expecting never to wake up again. But the next morning, he woke up, and he had barely bled because his blood was too thick. He literally could not bleed to death. He took this as a sign that he was supposed to live, and he suddenly felt motivated to survive. He decided to leave the shrine and follow the advice that one of the race organizers had given all of them at the start, which was, if you get lost, follow the clouds you can see just beyond the horizon at dawn. There you will find civilization. So Prosperi hopped up and began heading towards what he believed were those clouds. He walked for days in the desert, grabbing snakes and lizards off the ground and eating them raw. He said his inner caveman came out, like his primal desire to live, and he had no problems eating the things he was eating. Prosperi grew so dehydrated he couldn't even urinate anymore. So he began drinking the liquid inside of succulents that grew inside of dried up riverbeds, and he also began sucking out the moisture in his wet wipes that were in his backpack. On the 9th day, Prosperi saw a little shepherd girl off in the distance, and she saw him, and she was scared of him, and she turned and ran away. And at first, Prosperi is devastated because he has no strength to chase after her, but she had actually gone down to her tribe and told them about this strange man wandering the desert, and they came running up over the dunes, and they brought him in, and they gave him food and drink, and they sent someone to get police. After police picked him up and brought him back to their headquarters, he discovered he had walked over 181 miles from where he had gotten lost on the course all the way to Algeria. His family and race organizers had gone out looking for him after he went missing, but all they ever found was his shoelace, and so they assumed he was dead. It would take him 2 years to fully recover from this ordeal, but after he did, he went on to run 8 more. At around 8 p.m. on August 19th, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in this shack with his father Rivelino, as well as his 2 younger brothers, who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room, only a few feet away. Raimundo and his family were very, very poor. I mean, the shack was very small. It was only composed of 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and also the kitchen, which was connected by a single door. And they were truly like out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money. I mean, they really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, there wasn't really much else to do here, his father, Rivelino, came into the room from the kitchen, and he sat down next to him. And the two just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers. And as these 2 were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. And so he turned his attention and he looked into the dark kitchen, and he saw this dark figure on all 4s quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified. He has no idea what this is. And so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. And at that point, the 2 younger brothers, they've woken up, and all 4 of them were looking at each other like, what's going on? And Raimundo, he says to his dad, what was that? Now, it was clear that Rivelino was very unsettled by whatever this was. I mean, they didn't have pets. There was no other people inside of their shack. Like, there shouldn't be anything alive inside of the shack beyond them. So he doesn't know what it is. He's scared, but he tells his boys, it's okay. It's all right. I don't know what that is, but let's just stay here, we're safe. The door is locked, we're all here, we're safe. And so the boys, they all just kind of trusted their dad, and everybody just kind of hunkered down together and just sat there quietly, kind of waiting to see if they would hear anything else. And for a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Rivelino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. And at first, they couldn't really tell what these voices were saying. They were kind of garbled. But eventually, they all began to hear the same thing.
whoever was out there or whatever was out there was talking about Rivellino. Specifically, they could hear that name. And what they were kind of saying is, if Rivellino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And the moment that all the boys sort of picked up the fact that somebody's out there and they're threatening to harm Rivellino, they're all like, Dad, what do we do? What do we do? And Rivellino, I mean, he's hearing this too, but he tells his boys, it's okay. I don't know what's going on out there, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This is a prank. This can't be real. And so Rivellino told his sons their plan is they're just gonna stay put. They're in this room, they're safe, the door is locked. We are gonna wait until the sun comes up and then we'll figure out who did this, who's playing this prank on us. And so sure enough, Rivellino and his sons would stay in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m. when the sun began to come up again. And at that point, Rivellino told his sons to stay put and he was gonna go out there and investigate. And by this point, they had stopped hearing voices. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. It sort of felt like whatever that was, whoever that was, had passed. And so, the tension is gone, and the boys are like, okay, be careful out there, Dad. And so Rivellino, he walks over to the door that leads into the kitchen. He unlocks it, opens it up, and Raimundo, he's craning his neck, looking into the kitchen, but, he can't see anything moving around in there, even with the light coming in. And so Rivellino, he says, okay, boys, stay here. And then Rivellino goes out into the kitchen and shuts the door behind him. And while he's out there, Raimundo and his brothers, they're all listening anxiously, making sure their dad's not in trouble, but they just hear the sound of their dad just clearly walking around the kitchen. There's no commotion, there's nothing. And then a couple of minutes later, Rivellino comes back into the main room where the boys are, and he's got a knife in hand, but he tells them, it's okay, I got this from the kitchen, I'm just in case. There's nothing out here. I'm now going to go outside and just make sure nobody's outside the hut, okay? So again, stay put. I'll be right back. And so again, the boys, they're looking at their dad like, okay, we'll see you soon. Rivellino walked out again into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him, and then the boys heard the sound of the door that led outside open up. And then, presumably, Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder. And this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story, far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father, he opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and as soon as he did, he looked towards the door that led outside, and he saw it was wide open. And he saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out this smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad just kind of walking into this cloud, and then the smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad. His dad was gone. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, like, Dad, where are you going? And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. He just felt like, you can't go out there. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. Raimundo sprinted around his house, calling out for his dad, looking everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched this search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search, and then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. Also, people have no idea what that dark figure was skittering across their kitchen floor the night before Rivellino went missing, or who those voices were threatening to kill Rivellino, or the objects that Raimundo apparently saw floating in the sky spitting out yellow smoke. Nobody has any idea what any of that stuff is. All we know is Rivellino disappeared and 6 months later turned up dead in that crevice.
Little boy named Issei Sagawa was having this dream where he and his brother were being boiled alive to be eaten. Sagawa says when he woke up, he immediately began fantasizing about what it would be like to be on the other side of that, to be on the outside with a human inside of the pot that you're boiling, that you're going to eat. And he became totally obsessed with the idea of eating another person. By the time he was in first grade, he would find himself staring at his different classmates' legs, and his mouth would be watering because he wanted to take a bite out of their leg. For 3 decades, he was able to suppress that urge, but in 1981, those cannibalistic urges would get the better of him. One summer day while he was in Tokyo, he saw this woman that he wanted to eat, and he couldn't help himself, and so he began following her down the road, and he saw her go into her apartment. He waited for a minute, went around back, and climbed in the window, and when he got inside, she was asleep. And he hadn't thought of a plan for what he was going to do once he was inside, and so he's just standing there thinking, well, now what do I do? How am I going to eat her? What am I going to do next? And as he's sitting there wondering what to do next, she wakes up and she screams and he runs away. After this breaking and entering incident, Sagawa would actually seek help. So he goes to a psychiatrist and he says, this is what I did. I snuck into her house because I wanted to eat her. And the psychiatrist would end up telling Sagawa's family that I have to label him a high risk to society because he's not just thinking about doing these things, he's already acting out these fantasies. Now, Sagawa's father was extremely wealthy and powerful, and when he heard this from the psychiatrist, he was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so using his power and influence, he was able to kind of cover up what the psychiatrist had found, and he shipped his son to Paris. Once Sagawa landed in Paris, he enrolled at the Sorbonne University and began studying literature. Despite having sought help for his cannibalistic urges, when he was in Paris, he started having that urge again and he couldn't control it, and instead of going to another therapist or psychiatrist, he begins to look for another victim. Sagawa considered himself short, weak, and ugly, and so he was actually looking for a tall, beautiful Western woman so he could absorb their energy and somehow become a bigger, better version of himself. And so he began looking around Paris for tall, beautiful women that he could potentially eat, but no one seemed like a good fit until he met Renee Hartvelt. Renee was a tall, beautiful 25-year-old Dutch student who was going to school with Sagawa at Sorbonne. In order to get close to her, Sagawa would ask his father if he would give him some money so he could hire Renee to be his personal tutor. His father gives him the money, Sagawa hires Renee, and they strike up this working relationship together. And over time, Sagawa would build trust with Renee, they would become friends, and at some point he asked Renee if she'll actually come over to his apartment, something they had not done yet. And she's sitting in his apartment with her back turned to him. He leaves the room and comes back with a rifle, and he tries to fire it, but it jams. And she hasn't heard him do this, and so he's standing there and his weapon's now jammed. He hasn't fired it, and he just puts the weapon away and comes back out and acts like nothing's happened. And he's sitting there wondering, is this a sign that I'm not supposed to do this? But at the end of the night, when she finally left, he decides, you know what, I gotta go through with this. I have to eat her. And so the next night he gets her to come over again. He gets the rifle out when she's sitting with her back to him once again, except this time the rifle fires. Only for an instant, he felt really bad and thought, maybe I should call an ambulance. But then he stopped himself and he said, you've waited so long for this. You gotta just go through with it. He immediately tried to take a bite out of her, but it was too difficult and unpalatable. So he calmly leaves his apartment, he goes to the store, he gets a blade, he comes back, and he's able to begin removing pieces of Renee so he can eat them. Over the next 2 days, Sagawa would eat most of Renee, and he would take pictures of himself throughout the entire experience. When he finally felt full, he left a couple pieces still in his freezer, but put the rest of her in a suitcase and went to dump her in a lake. But as he was wheeling these heavy suitcases around town, people saw them, and it just drew a lot of suspicion. And at some point, someone must have called the police. They show up, they ask him what's inside the suitcase, they open it up, and there's Renee. When questioned about it, he just said, I killed her to eat her flesh. Sagawa awaited trial for 2 years in a French prison, and when he finally went in front of a French judge, when the judge read the details of this crime, it seemed so crazy and outrageous that the judge decided there's no way Sagawa can be sane. And so he was deemed insane and unfit to stand trial. He was ordered to go to a mental institution where he would be held indefinitely. Shortly after that, the French deported Sagawa back to Japan, where they expected him to remain in a mental institution for the rest of his life. But that didn't happen because the French dropped his case and his documents were sealed. And when he arrived in Japan, the Japanese could not get access to his court documents, and so they did not have a case against Sagawa, and so they had to let him walk free. And so in 1986, Sagawa checked himself out of the Japanese mental institution that he had been sent to, and he's been free ever since. This is a picture of what police discovered when they opened up Sagawa's fridge inside of his apartment in Paris. This is a picture of his kitchen inside of that apartment, where you can clearly see plates and different utensils that were all used to eat Renee. This is a picture of the suitcase that Sagawa was lugging around that police showed up and asked him to open and found Renee inside of. And this is Sagawa today, walking freely in Tokyo, even though he blatantly killed and ate someone and openly admits to it and has even profited off of it. He's written books and he's been featured on TV shows. He's even been called in to be a food critic. But what's even more horrifying is that Sagawa openly says that before he dies, he's going to do this again. He can't live with himself unless he eats at least one more person. So that's living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, "The woods just went completely silent. Very odd." As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, "Oh, what are you looking at?" And he said, "I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road." He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest, and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, "What time did he say that happened?" Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him, and so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, "It was between 7:50 and 8. Why?" At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, "Here, let me take a look at it." As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, "Well, did your hair get in front of the lens?" And she said, "No, I was holding it about a foot away from my head, and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair." And so he looked at it again, and he asked her, "Well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe?" And she said, "Yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible." And so, not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, "Did you manipulate your resolution settings?" And she said, "No, I don't even know how to do that." So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below.
So at midnight on May 1st, 1971, a 20-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ford was sleeping on a couch in the front room of a small house near a city in Arkansas called Texarkana. Elizabeth and her husband Bobby were staying at the house with Bobby's brother and his wife, who owned the house. Bobby and his brother were still both awake, and Elizabeth could hear them talking in the kitchen quietly. The house was surrounded by woods and swampland, and Elizabeth had opened up a window above the couch, so a breeze was blowing in. Now, usually, she slept really well with the sound of the woods in the background, but tonight, she was tossing and turning. And this was because, as she lay there trying to sleep, she became very aware of a unique sound coming from outside that was not the sound of, the trees blowing in the wind or the insects buzzing. This was something else. It was a slow creaking sound. And at first, it kind of sounded like it could be out in the woods somewhere, but eventually Elizabeth realized this creaking sound was sort of moving back and forth, right outside on the porch below the open window. Suddenly, Elizabeth's eyes flew open and she looked at the window because this creaking sound had just intensified and then came to a stop on the immediate other side of this window, like there was something heavy right outside. Elizabeth sat up to face the window, But she didn't see anything outside through the screen. And so right away she felt totally relieved. She didn't know what that sound was, but clearly there was nothing there. However, just to be certain, she decided she would go a little bit closer to the screen and actually look right up close to make sure there was nothing down below on the porch. And so Elizabeth leaned forward and pressed her face to the screen and began to look. And as she did, this dark figure down below suddenly rose up and completely blocked out the window. And Elizabeth's looking at it, having no idea what it is. And before she could do anything, this huge thing slashed at the screen, and this big reddish furry brown paw with razor-sharp claws cut through the screen and nearly cut Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth screamed and practically fell over, and this dark creature outside turned and bolted and disappeared. And then a moment later, Elizabeth's husband Bobby and his brother came running into the room asking what was going on. Elizabeth was so shocked at what she had just experienced that all she could say to her husband was, "It's a bear! It's a bear!" Bobby helped Elizabeth off the couch and then told her and his brother's wife to stay in the house and away from the windows. And then Bobby and his brother got shotguns and flashlights and went outside. Once outside, Bobby and his brother began scanning all around the porch area where Elizabeth had apparently seen this bear to see where it was. They held their flashlights out and they scanned the tree lines. They looked all over the place, all around the front of the property, but there was no sign of this animal. And so the brothers looked at each other and nodded, and then they both left the porch and went different directions, kind of looping around the back of the house. They were going to scan the entire property and meet up at the back. And when they met up at the back, they still hadn't found this bear, and so they walked away from the house towards the tree line and did another big sweep together of the entire perimeter, again looking for any sign of this animal. But there was nothing. And so after a while of circling the property, the brothers decided that, this bear must have just run off. And so Bobby and his brother returned to the porch to figure out their next move. Both Bobby and his brother were hunters, and they knew that usually the best thing to do with the bears that roamed this area was to leave them alone. I mean, these bears could grow to be 500 pounds, and if they were provoked, they could run at 35 miles an hour. And so generally, you just stayed away from these things, and they'd leave you alone too. However, as the brothers were sitting there talking through what had happened that night, they both said, it definitely seemed like this bear was different. I mean, apparently it was aggressive enough to come right up to the house, unprovoked, and reach in and swipe at Elizabeth, which obviously was not normal bear behavior. And so, to Bobby and his brother, this meant that they really couldn't just leave this bear alone. They had to go out there and find it and kill it to protect themselves. And so Bobby lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and then the two brothers came up with a plan for how they were going to go find this bear. Bobby's brother would man the front of the house, and Bobby would man the back of the house, and they would stay in their respective positions monitoring the property until either they saw the bear and dealt with it, or until the sun came up, at which point they could go get help. And so after agreeing to this plan, Bobby took one final drag on his cigarette, chucked it to the ground, and then with his shotgun in one hand and his flashlight in the other, he stepped off the porch and walked around to the back of the house and stared off into the darkness. Bobby had only been in the back of the house for a couple of minutes manning his post when he began to smell this horrible smell. Now, at first he thought it was just some sort of wet, musky smell that came over from the swampland nearby. But as he continued to smell it, it got heavier and more pungent. It smelled like a wet, decaying animal. Bobby tensed up and aimed his flashlight up at the tree line and began looking back and forth, trying to figure out where this horrible smell was coming from. And as he was doing this, he suddenly heard the sound of tree branches snapping off to his left. And so he whipped his flashlight over and shined it, and he saw this big, dark figure charging across the property away from him into the forest. Bobby instinctively raised his shotgun and fired, and then after shooting, a loud yelp echoed in the air, and then Bobby just took off running in the direction he had just fired, and as he's running across the yard, he's screaming for his brother, who had already heard the shotgun blast, so he was coming around the house, and the two men linked up, and as they're running in the direction of this bear, Bobby's telling his brother, "I think I got it, I shot the bear." But they get over to where Bobby had last seen it and where he heard this yelp come from, and there was nothing, there was no bear. Still, the brothers did feel a little relieved. They figured even if they couldn't find this thing, clearly Bobby had hit it. He had heard the sound of it yelping out, and so maybe by at least wounding it, it would stay away and leave them alone. But just then, the men heard the sound of their wives screaming from inside the house. The men immediately ran back to the house, and as they got closer, Bobby again began to smell that horrible smell. And right as Bobby's foot hit that first porch step, his brother from behind him screamed out, "Stop!" But it was too late. The bear was on the porch. That's why the women were screaming. They had seen it, and Bobby's brother had seen it, but Bobby hadn't. And now he was too close to it to get away. And before Bobby could raise his gun to protect himself, this thing attacked. And Bobby felt this horrible burning, tearing sensation in his arm. He fell to the ground, twisting wildly back and forth, trying to protect himself. He was pinned underneath this enormous bear, level with its chest, with its arms and legs on either side of him. And that horrible smell he was smelling was clearly coming from this animal. That's all he could smell from underneath. But just then, it was like a miracle, because to his side, Bobby could see there was an opening, and so he rolled and somehow got out from underneath this enormous creature. Bobby scrambled up to his feet, and he darted past the bear and rammed into the closed front door of the house. It popped open, he fell inside, and his wife ran forward and shut the door behind him, leaving Bobby's brother outside on the porch alone with the bear. But before any of them could do anything about that, they heard the sound of his brother's shotgun going off. Then there was a long moment of silence. Inside the house, everybody was frozen. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened and Bobby's brother walked inside. Everyone was too shocked to say anything, so for a second they all just stared at each other, and then finally Bobby asked him, "Is the bear dead?" And Bobby's brother, with a trembling voice, said no. And that wasn't a bear. As soon as dawn broke and it was not dark outside anymore, Bobby's wife drove him to the hospital, where they would treat him for shock and for the wound to his shoulder. They had hoped to find it somewhere on the property, either dead or wounded, based on Bobby's brother's account of having fired at it basically point blank, but the creature was gone. They did find its tracks though, and this discovery made it clear that Bobby's brother was right, that this wasn't a bear. Because in the dirt surrounding the house were all these bizarre footprints and handprints of a creature that seemed to walk on its hind legs with 3 toes on each, and had 3 long sharp claws on its hands. And as unbelievable as this all seemed to the police, this actually tracked with what Bobby's brother said he saw when he was out on the porch. He said he saw a creature with reddish-brown hair all over it that stood over 7 feet tall, and after being shot, it took off running on 2 legs, and it ran fast. But the most terrifying thing about it, at least according to Bobby's brother, was actually its eyes. They were blazing red. And when the news of this attack spread to the nearest town, which was called Fouke, the people there knew exactly what this creature was. For 200 years, people in that part of Arkansas had been talking about this huge creature that was sort of like a Sasquatch that roamed the forest and the swamps. They said it was fast and elusive, and it ate livestock and pets. They called it the Fouke Monster, or sometimes the Boggy Creek Monster. But Bobby Ford and his family's encounter with this creature was unlike any other story that had been told about the Fouke Monster. While some people claimed in the past that this creature had attacked people, nobody had ever heard of it actually coming up to somebody's house, trying to break in and terrorize a family. Bobby's ordeal would inspire the 1972 horror movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. Over the years, police officers and some scientists have suggested that maybe what Bobby and his brother encountered that night was actually a feral pig. However, authorities have never actually been able to pinpoint what this thing was. Nobody knows. And to this day, hikers and hunters near the swamps of southwest Arkansas and also across the border into East Texas still report run-ins with the legendary Fouke Monster. Evening of August 1st, 2015, a 20-year-old man named Fraser Beloyi walked alone down a main road toward his village in the South African province of Limpopo. Fraser was on his way home from work, and he was pretty desperate to get there. It was only about 7:30 p.m., and usually around this time, Fraser was used to seeing other people out and about on this road, just kind of walking around in the dusk or, chatting or doing various errands, but tonight there was nobody out there. And in fact, in recent days, this area of Limpopo had basically become a ghost town. Nobody went out unless they absolutely had to, because over the last 10 days, over 20 people in this area had been brutally mauled. The victims had all insisted that the creature that had mauled them was some kind of 4-legged demon, and they had begun calling it the Beast. Now, Fraser considered himself a pretty level-headed person who did not necessarily buy into the hype around this beast. He figured it was very likely just a dog. But still, he didn't want to get attacked. And so as he walked down this vacant road, he periodically looked over his shoulder just to make sure no dog was following him. As Fraser continued to walk along, he looked up and saw the huge forest fire that was raging on a mountain miles and miles off in the distance. A few days ago, the fire had started, and from Fraser's perspective, it still seemed to be going strong. In fact, in the darkness, it almost looked like the mountain was glowing red. Just then, Fraser noticed the turnoff for the shortcut that would take him through some forest back to his home, and when he got there, he stopped and looked over his shoulder one more time to make sure he was still all alone, and he was, and then he stepped off the main road, into the woods, and into the darkness. Under the tree canopy, the night suddenly seemed a lot darker. Fraser did his best to think about the chores he needed to do for his mother once he got home, instead of thinking about the beast. But he'd only been on this path for about 300 feet when he suddenly heard a rustling from behind him. And so right away, Fraser stopped and turned around and looked where the noise was coming from. But all he saw was darkness. There was nothing there. And so Fraser, for a whole minute, just stood there staring out into the tree line, waiting for something to move. But nothing did. And so Fraser told himself he was just being paranoid. Everything was fine. And then he turned back around and kept on walking. But pretty quickly, his walk turned into a jog. And he was almost to the end of this path, almost out of the forest. He could see his village. It was right there. When he heard noises behind him again. Except now, in addition to the rustling sounds, he heard a new sound. It was like a wheezing sound, like a sick animal that was breathing heavily. Now, Fraser knew he was not just being paranoid. Something was out there, and it seemed like it might be following him. Without slowing down, Fraser looked over his shoulder again to see what was out there, but again, he just saw nothing. It was just shadows. However, when he turned back around and kept on going towards his village, he heard this loud crashing sound behind him, like a massive animal had leapt out of the brush and landed on the path behind him. And so Fraser was immediately so scared he couldn't even turn around. He just started sprinting toward the village, and all he could hear behind him were these loud, pounding footsteps as whatever this was gaining on him. And so Fraser was so instantly terrified that instinctively he just started sprinting off without even looking behind him. And so as he's running, this thing's gaining on him, and again he can hear this awful wheezing sound coming from whatever this is, as if there was something wrong with its lungs. And in Fraser's panic as he's sprinting through the forest, Fraser's telling himself it's just gotta be a rabid dog, that's why it's making those sounds. But he knew that didn't track. This thing is huge. This can't just be a rabid dog. And so Fraser just kept on running, and finally he got out of the trees, back into his village, and at the exact same moment, the pounding footsteps behind him came to a stop. But again, Fraser, he didn't turn around. He's too scared. He just ran for his door. His house was right there in front of him, and he gets to his door. He's about to open it up, and right as he does, he feels this searing pain in his neck. This creature, whatever it was, had leapt and grabbed onto him and bit down on the back of his neck. And so Fraser crumpled to the ground and threw his arms up over his head to protect himself, and with one eye, he can see it's this massive black creature on top of him, chewing on the lower half of his face. And so Fraser, he couldn't even feel any pain. He just began screaming for help, and he tried to push it off of him, but he couldn't. And then a second later, a flash of metal came across his eye as his mother and other villagers who had seen this happening and heard him screaming came out and began smashing whatever this was with shovels. And so a second later, Fraser's pulled away and dragged towards his house, and this huge black creature, it marched over to the edge of the tree line and just stopped, turned, and looked back at Fraser and his mother and the neighbors. And Fraser, as he's sitting there in total shock, he can tell that whatever this thing is, this enormous dog-like creature, this had to be the beast. That's what just attacked him. And in this moment, Fraser realized, this creature may have the shape of a dog, but it was not a dog. South Africa has its share of wild dogs, jackals, and hyenas, and typically they're multicolored and fairly small. And this thing was jet black, pitch black, and gigantic. And when this thing first started chasing Fraser, he'd had that panicked thought that maybe it was a rabid dog. But rabid animals are typically lethargic and confused. And this thing that was 15 feet away from them was absolutely alert and calm. The only thing sick about it was that horrible wheezing sound it would make as it breathed. And as Fraser and his mother and the neighbors just stood there staring at this thing, This creature just continued to stare back at them with piercing eyes. And its eyes were not normal. These were not like animal eyes or dog eyes. They were too small and set at the wrong angle. And there was real sentience behind them. They were human eyes. Just then, Fraser's mother grabbed Fraser and yanked him, kind of jerking him back to reality, and he scrambled to his feet, and he and his mother and the two neighbors, they took off running back into their respective homes. All the while, this creature just sat there on the edge of the forest, staring still in the direction of Fraser and his home. Once inside of Fraser's house, his mother immediately dialed the emergency number to tell the police about what had just happened, but the police told her they were not going to send people out there to deal with some dog. And so Fraser's mother decided she would just treat her son's wounds on her own until this dog-like creature had left, and then once it had, she would get him a ride to the hospital. However, as Fraser and his mother stared out the window at this creature, it didn't leave. It just sat there staring back at Fraser and his mother with these hideous human eyes for hours and hours. Finally, in the morning, it was gone. The attack on Fraser was the last straw for the people of his village. They believed the creature that had bit his face was the demon beast that had hurt so many other people. And so the elders of Fraser's village came up with a plan of how to deal with this beast. And so a few days after the attack on Fraser, this group of elders went off on a journey up into that mountain that Fraser had seen off in the distance that had that huge forest fire on it. And they were there for 2 whole days before returning to the village and telling everyone that they had successfully performed a ritual that had appeased their ancestors, and so hopefully now the attacks would stop. And sure enough, they did. They did not see the beast again. At least 40 people in Limpopo had encountered the beast at some point, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off, like the neighbors did with Fraser. But because this beast was never caught, and it did stop attacking the village and just kind of disappeared, nobody ever actually figured out what it was. To this day, people in Fraser's village maintain that this creature was a demon and that it came down from the burning mountain, because every person, including Fraser, who had encountered this beast, noted its wheezing, heavy breathing, as if its lungs had been damaged by smoke. In all, at least 40 people in Limpopo encountered this beast, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off. But because it was never caught, there is no definitive proof of what it actually was.
24, Fred Beck, along with 4 other gold prospectors, stumbled out of a forest right near Mount St. Helens in Washington state. And they swore to each other that they would not tell a soul what they had seen in the mountains the night before. But literally within a few hours of making that promise to each other, one of the men had spilled the beans at a bar. Very quickly, their story would garner major national media attention and even drew some international attention as well. This is their story. So the week leading up to the men arriving back in town with this crazy story, they had been prospecting for gold in an area they were very accustomed to working in. In fact, for the past 6 years, they had been going to this spot. So it was an area they knew well. And so this particular week that they were out there had been really successful. They had found a whole bunch of gold. It was like this great run of luck and nobody wanted to leave. Unfortunately, one of the men named Fred Beck started complaining of a really bad toothache. Now, they're about 2 miles away from this town. It's very rugged terrain. It's not safe for someone to travel alone in case something were to happen. And so Fred needed one or all of these men to come back with him. None of them wanted to leave, but they were willing to compromise. And they said, let's stay here today, and then we'll leave first thing tomorrow morning. And so Fred didn't really have much of a choice, and so he agreed, and they spent the rest of the day prospecting for gold. When the sun started to go down, the men decided it was time to pack it in and head to their cabin. Now, because these men had worked in this area for the past 6 years, they had actually built a small log cabin centrally located in this area so they could just crash out there and continue to work and not need to commute out of the town. The cabin, though, was not built for comfort. It was built entirely for practicality. It was barely big enough to sleep all 5 men, and in fact, 2 of them had to sleep in the same bed, like right against one another, and then the other 3 had to sleep on the ground. There were no windows in this cabin. It was like this awful chamber that they were trapped inside of. But it was sturdy, it protected them from the elements, and it was enough because they were out there for work, not for pleasure. So as they're walking towards their tiny little cabin, they get just outside the cabin and notice a very large footprint, like an animal print, outside the cabin. The men stop, they look down. Now, these are 5 rugged mountain men that are accustomed to being out in the wild. They've had their fair share of run-ins with large predators, and so they quickly said, oh, that's a bear print. But upon closer inspection, as they're looking at this print, they noticed it was 19 inches long. That's way too big to be a bear print. And so they start speculating about what type of animal could make that print. As they're speculating, one of the men brings up that over the course of the week when he had been away from the group, a little ways away from the cabin, he had noticed a similar, not nearly as big, but a similar print. And when he had bent down to look at the print and inspect it to see what it was, he said he heard a whistling sound coming from the forest that was right next to him. And so he stood up and he looked, but he didn't see where the whistling was coming from. And he thought to himself, I don't know what animal makes that sound. So he's looking out, he can't see where the whistling's coming from, and then he hears whistling behind him. The same sound, but on the opposite side of him. And he turns around and he looks, and there's nothing over there as well. And he's trying to put together in his head what animal makes that sound. He knows it's not the people he's out there with because they were way over near the cabin and he could actually see them from where he was. And he starts getting this really uneasy feeling that whatever made this huge print is probably in the woods right now watching me, whistling at me. And so he abandons the print and heads back to camp, but was too embarrassed to bring the story up to the group in fear that they would think he was exaggerating, so he never brought it up. When this guy tells this story to the group, Fred Beck would say, "That's weird. I heard whistling coming from the forest too. I thought it was you guys." They figured they were dealing with a large predator. They decide that it's in their best interest to forego a campfire outside the cabin, which they normally would do at night, and instead just go right inside the cabin and shut the door because they don't know what animals are out here and they want to play it safe. So they're sitting inside their windowless little dark cabin and they start feeling pretty hungry. And they decide they want to boil some water to make food, but they don't have any water. Normally, when any of these guys went out to fetch water, they would go by themselves. The spring was not very far away from their cabin. They just walk out, scoop some water up, and come back. But because they were all feeling pretty uneasy, and they didn't know what this big animal was that was in their general vicinity, Fred, along with one of the other men, whose name was Hank, decide to go together and to bring their rifles just in case. Fred and Hank begin walking over to this stream that was only about 100 meters away from where they were. The moon was out, so there was a little bit of light coming from that, but it was mostly dark. And they're walking over to this stream. Then all of a sudden, Hank stops and raises his rifle up at the side of this embankment that was totally forested all the way up the side of the valley. Fred looks where Hank is aiming, and immediately he can tell what he's looking at. Standing a couple hundred meters up this mountain is this creature that's very tall, standing on 2 legs. It appears to be hairy, that's poking its head around a tree, and it's looking at them. They could only see it because the moon was casting light directly on it, so it was totally illuminated. As soon as Fred recognizes what they're looking at, the creature ducks back behind the tree. At the same time, Hank fires 3 shots in its general direction, and then there's silence. And then all of a sudden, it comes barreling out from behind the tree and is running straight down the mountain towards them while whistling over its shoulder, looking like it's communicating with something behind it. Hank starts firing in its direction. It's clearly not striking this creature, but at some point, the creature disappears. They don't know where it went. It's dark out. The only way they could see it before was because the moonlight happened to illuminate it. Now they don't know where it is. Fred and Hank abandon the water idea and they run right back to the cabin. They jump inside, shut the door, and they start barricading the door shut. The other men are like, what the heck is going on? And they start explaining what happened. They didn't know if it was a person or if it was this creature. They heard that whistling sound. All the guys are spooked. And now they're barricaded inside of this tiny cabin and it's totally dark. There's no windows, so they can't even see what's going on outside of the cabin. And so they just had to sit there and hope that this creature does not come anywhere near them. After a long period of total silence, the men start to feel like, okay, whatever that was, it's not coming back. It's late at night. Let's just try to get some sleep. And so the men all lay down and eventually doze off to sleep. Then at some point in the middle of the night, something smashes into the side of the cabin, causing them all to wake up. Hank's yelling out because a piece of wood that actually made up the cabin had come loose from whatever had hit the side of the cabin and fallen onto him. So the group gets up. There's a little bit of light coming through this now little crack in the wall from where this wood plank came out. They can see what's happening now. There's a little bit of light inside. They run over, they get this plank off of Hank, and as they're trying to kind of make sense of this chaotic moment, they start hearing what sounds like lots of people running around the outside of their cabin. Hank, who was closest to this little slat that had been created from one of the planks falling out, just turns his head to look out the slat. Because of the moon, there was a little bit of illumination, and when he looked out, he was horrified because he saw 3 creatures, these tall, ape-like creatures, the same one that Fred and Hank had been shooting at up over at the valley before. They're standing 10-15 meters away from the cabin, standing upright, looking at the cabin. They're holding these small boulders in their hands. And as Hank is looking through the slat, he's trying to get a little bit closer to get a better look. One of the creatures bends down and sees that Hank is looking at him, and he winds up and he throws the boulder and it smashes against this little slat. Hank basically falls over because he's trying to avoid this boulder being thrown at him, but the slat was small enough that it didn't go through. Hank's telling the rest of the men that there's 3 of them. There's 3 of them. They're right there. The men are grabbing their rifles. They're getting ready to aim out of the slat to try to take a shot at one of these creatures. But by the time they have a sight picture, there's no one out there, except they hear these footsteps and they start hearing whistling coming from the other sides of the cabin where they have no way of seeing what's going on because there's no windows and that gap in the cabin was only facing one way. And so they just sit there in silence as they hear all this whistling and footsteps and shuffling happening outside of their cabin. Then all of a sudden they hear slamming against the one door that leads into the cabin. They had barricaded the door already, so they go up and they're pressing back against the barricade as whatever is outside is trying to break into the cabin, but it can't get through the barricade. When they couldn't break in the front door, there was a barrage of these boulders smashing into the cabin. Now, these men had built the cabin. They knew it was sturdy, but they didn't know if it could withstand boulders hitting it. And so for hours, these rocks and boulders are smashing into the cabin. They never see them again through that slat. They kept periodically looking and there was never any creatures that were on that side. It was like the creatures knew that they could be seen on that side but couldn't be seen elsewhere. Finally, it just stops and they sit down in the middle of the cabin. Fred was sitting in such a way that he could actually see the slat in the cabin that was now open and exposed. And as he's sitting there, Fred is horrified when he sees a hand slide into the cabin. A hairy, big ape hand that reaches in and starts fumbling around, grabs hold of an axe that was leaning up against the inside of the cabin. And as it's getting ready to pull it out, Fred runs over and twists the axe so it won't slide through the slat. And so the creature's slamming the axe, trying to get it out at the same time that Hank takes a shot and shoots right through the slat. The creature releases it and runs away. They hear all this whistling very close to their cabin, which made them realize that they had just been quietly waiting outside of their cabin. They had never left. But after Hank had taken that shot at the thing's hand, it sounded like almost a stampede was running away off into the forest. And at that point, the group was fairly certain that it was done. The next morning, when they saw through that slat in their cabin that the sun had finally come up, the men packed only the bare necessities. They got their weapons. When they finally opened up that door, all over the ground, all around the cabin were these rocks that clearly had been thrown at the cabin. The cabin itself had obviously withstood the barrage, but there was gash marks and slashes all over it. Feeling very lucky, the men start making their way out of the valley and they make their way all the way back to town. And after the story kind of went viral, loads of people went out there to try to find these creatures, but no one ever could. Mike Woolley decided he wanted to go deer hunting in his hometown in Louisiana. It was a cold day, it was great conditions for a hunt, and Mike had a deer stand that was set up about 1.5 miles down this old logging road that no one really used. He would take his truck and he would drive about halfway down that road, and then he'd get out and he would walk the remaining, half mile, 3/4 of a mile to his deer stand, because if he drove his truck in, he would scare away all the deer. He made it to his deer stand by about 3 p.m. that day, and he'd only been there for about 30 minutes when all of a sudden this young doe comes running across and stops right in front of his deer stand. The doe lays down and is clearly exhausted, and Mike would say that it looked like something was chasing it, and he assumed it was some huge buck. And so Mike's getting ready for this big buck to emerge when out of the corner of his eye, he sees something pretty big jump out of a tree. And he kind of turns his head and looks, and it's not a buck. It looked like a gorilla. He thought, okay, a gorilla must have gotten out of the zoo. But then he's thinking to himself, there isn't a zoo around here, and there's no circus around here, so it can't be an escaped gorilla. And then he was like, okay, someone must have put on a gorilla suit to stop me from deer hunting. They're out here to try to get me to leave this spot. You know, they're anti-deer hunting, and so they're here to screw with me. And so Mike, believing that was the case, he starts yelling to them, you know, take off your mask. This isn't okay. This isn't funny. I have a license to be here. You can't be here. You need to leave. Like, get out of here. And so this thing that he believes is a person wearing a gorilla suit just completely does not react. It's just standing looking at him. And it's about 15 or 20 meters away from him at this time, and it's just staring at him. It's on two legs. Mike starts to feel uneasy because he's thinking to himself, if this is somebody in a gorilla suit that's trying to get me to leave, wouldn't they right now announce that and say, you need to leave? They wouldn't just stand there doing nothing. And so Mike, even though he knew it was going to probably escalate the situation, raises up his rifle in the direction of this person to use his scope, to basically zoom in on this person and get a better look. And when he raises his rifle and he zooms in, he immediately knows that this is not a person wearing a mask. Steam was coming off of its face like it had been running. I mean, it was 30 degrees outside. And he said he could see its nostrils flaring like it was out of breath, or that perhaps it was angry. He didn't know. Even though it wasn't a person wearing a mask, it looked very human-like because it had human teeth, flat teeth. It had, he said, human eyelashes. And just the general structure of its face appeared to be human. And he thought to himself, is this a feral human? Is that possible? Is this a person that has been born and raised in the wild? And so as he's pointing the weapon at this creature, looking through the scope, just totally dumbfounded. Mike has no intention of shooting at this point. He really just wanted to stare at it. The creature roars, and Mike describes it as like a lion's roar. This thing was suddenly really upset with Mike. And Mike believed later on that it was because he raised his weapon at this thing. As soon as it roars, Mike said that about 100 meters in the other direction, he hears this really loud, piercing whistle coming through the forest. As soon as that whistle comes through the forest, the creature that was still growling stops and turns its head in the direction of this whistle. And it whistles back. And so Mike, I mean, the hair on the back of his neck is standing up. He knows they're communicating, probably about him. And as he's realizing this, he lowers his weapon and he's looking at the creature in front of him who's whistling and looking in the direction of this way. And then that creature snaps back and looks right at Mike. And as he's wondering what he should do next, another creature walks out of the tree line and stands right next to the first creature. And the way it walked, it was walking like a human. It was on two legs. And they're both standing about 20 meters away looking directly at Mike. Mike is terrified. And he would say that he knew that he had to make a run for it. And so he leaps from his stand and starts running towards his truck, which is about a half mile away. And he said as soon as he did, he could tell that one of them at least started sprinting after him. And he looked over his shoulder as he's running towards the logging road, and he sees that one of the creatures is running parallel to him, easily running as fast as he is. It's choosing to stay, 5-10 meters away from him, but running in step with him the whole way. It's like it's forcing him to leave the forest. And so Mike is running, waiting to get attacked by this creature. He finally gets to his truck, he clambers inside and shuts the doors, and he looks out of his window and he sees the creature just standing there looking at him from the trees. He looks in his rear view and he sees that the other creature had also been running after him on the logging road, that the two of them had basically herded him to his car. It was an intelligent move. Mike believes that because he raised his weapon at that first creature, that triggered a series of events that led to them chasing him out of the woods. He said that he was the aggressor, not the other way around. We don't know if either of those stories are true, but certainly they are terrifying. So I'd love to get your reaction to these two stories in the comments. Are these total fabrications, or is there some truth to Bigfoot, and these stories are just evidence of that? If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to steal the like button's phone and turn off all their alarms so they're late for work tomorrow. Also, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. Every year, dozens of people, hikers, hunters, backpackers, will go off into the wilds of North America and then come out again claiming to have seen Bigfoot, the 8 to 10 feet tall, intelligent, bipedal, hairy creature that kind of is a cross between man and beast. And there's literally been thousands of sightings of that particular creature all over North America. And despite the thousands of sightings, there's never been a substantiated claim, so Bigfoot has become an urban legend. But no matter how you feel about Bigfoot, whether it exists or it doesn't, if you read through some of the first-hand accounts of these people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in North America, some of them are horrifying. And one account that stands out to me as being the most terrifying comes out of Oregon. There's a couple hot spots all over North America where some of the most sightings of Bigfoot occur, and one of them is in Oregon. In particular, it's the northwestern section of Oregon. And that's where today's story is going to come out of, and it is Jeff Boiler's story. Jeff was a Marine. He was then a police officer, then he became a deputy sheriff, and then he ultimately became a lawyer. What really stands out to me about Jeff's story is that he strikes me as a credible, skeptical guy who, when interviewed, because he's been on a TV show called Paranormal Witness on the Sci-Fi Channel, he did a follow-on interview. He's you can Google him, Jeff Boiler's Bigfoot sighting. The way he tells the story, it's like he's not trying to dress it up. He's not trying to make it more dramatic than it really was. It's like he's just telling you what happened to him. And he's not trying to create a theory as to what it was, but rather just, here it is. Here's what happened, as I remember it. And it allows you to listen to this story and really relate to it. And it makes it that much more eerie as you listen to what happened to him. And so today I'm going to be telling Jeff's story. But before I get into that, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format with lots of distracting hand gestures, then you have come to the right place, because that is all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's something you'd be into, I would ask you to please gently disembowel the like button, and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. Back in 1997, Jeff Boiler was a fit, single guy that had been in the Marine Corps for a little while, and then he'd been a police officer, and now he was looking to do something new with his life, and he had always been a huge fan of nature. He loved hiking and hunting, and so he just kind of up and decided to move to Oregon to just be back in nature. And so he goes out to Oregon. He doesn't really know what he's going to do for a job. One of Jeff's friends, who is the elected sheriff of a very rural county in northwestern Oregon, reached out to Jeff and said, hey, with your background, you were in the Marine Corps, you were a police officer, would you want to be one of our deputy sheriffs out here in northwestern Oregon? And Jeff's like, wow, great, and took the job. So after being on the job for a couple of months, Jeff is really happy. He loves his job, and he gets off one day from work pretty early, and he steps outside, and he would recall that it was like one of the most beautiful days he had seen in recent memory. It was just this gorgeous day, and even though initially he was planning to just go home, he was like, you know what? I'm gonna go on a hike. He wanted to go to this fairly hard to access section of the woods that was a little ways up the mountain where 20 years earlier he had actually buried one of his very close friends. And so he thought, you know what, today I'm gonna make that trip up to his grave, I'm gonna pay my respects. That's a good way to spend such a beautiful day. So he hopped in his Jeep and he started driving over to the woods that would take him up to this gravesite. It was an unmarked trail, but he had a map, he knew where it was, so he headed over. Now, Jeff was highly competent in the wilderness, but it needs to be said that he was basically going to be hiking into a section of the Cascade Mountains that was unmarked. This is a very isolated, unmarked area. And in fact, Jeff would even say that sometimes when you would walk around this section of the Cascade Mountains, you would wonder to yourself, has anyone ever been here before? Like, this is such a wild and open expanse. Am I the first person to ever step foot here? It's a section of Oregon that is totally just wild. So Jeff arrives at the dirt lot that's right on the edge of this forest that goes up the side of this mountain. And before he steps in and starts making his way up, he gets his map out and he kind of roughly charts a course, because again, there's no trail in here. He puts his map away and he begins walking up this mountain. He's been walking for about 2 hours and the terrain's really bad. And he decides, you know what, why don't I deviate from the course that I was on and try to get to a more open area that might be able to kind of bank around to get up to the gravesite. He looked on the map and he could see that parallel to where he was going up this mountain, there seemed to be a strip of clearing where it might be easier going. It would require a bit of work to get over to it, but once he was there, he believed he could get up to the gravesite. So before he makes that movement over to the clearing, there was a stream running right next to him, freshwater stream, and so he just bends down, he splashes some water on his face, he gets a drink, and before he actually starts moving towards this clearing, because now he's deviating from the path that he intended to take, and this is an unmarked trail. So he knew that he would need to be really certain where he was going. He didn't have a GPS, this is 1997. He just had his map and compass. So he pulls out his map one more time, he looks at where he needs to go, he closes it up, and so he pulls out his compass and he takes what's called an azimuth, which basically is a way to make sure you're going in the right direction. And so he pulls the compass up to his eye, and as he's looking, he sees just to the right of his viewpoint, about 20 feet above him, there is a tree and a boulder, and behind that tree, someone is watching him. And so he lowers his compass and he just kind of glances over, and he can tell that it's clearly a figure. It's got two eyes in its head and it's looking at him. And he's not immediately scared. He thinks that this is a person who's kind of poking their head around a tree at him. And it's daylight. He knows he's out in the middle of nowhere, but he's looking up at it, and he involuntarily cocks his head, like, huh? And this thing cocks its head. It's mimicking me. It steps out from behind the tree, and it's this huge human-looking figure that looks very hairy. It's like 8 foot tall. And Jeff's looking up at it like, that's not a human. And so, not really sure what it is, he instinctively reaches for a sidearm, but he can't get it out of its holster. And he's like fumbling with it, and he's keeping his eyes on this thing that's, maybe 50 feet away from him, 20 feet up on this rocky outcropping. He can't get it out. And the figure's just looking down at him, and it's still got its head cocked to the side. He finally looks down to free his pistol. He draws the pistol, but the creature's gone. And he's like, I gotta get a better look. There was a tree that was pretty high that had a bunch of low branches that he could climb up. That would, if he climbed up maybe 15 or 20 feet, he could probably look over into this rocky outcropping. So he starts climbing up this tree, and he looks, and he's now level with that rocky outcropping, and he's looking out, and it stretches off quite a ways. There's a whole stretch of forest right there. And he's looking, and he can't see or hear anything. And he's starting to wonder to himself, like, did I really just see that? Is my mind playing tricks on me? Am I hallucinating? And so he decides, you know what, I'm going to climb back down, and I'm going to go up onto that rocky outcropping. Wasn't planning to, but now I'm going to, and I want to see if I can see some tracks or just see where this thing went. He's a Marine, he was a police officer, he was very comfortable in the wild. He just didn't really scare that easily, and so he's just kind of curious. And he's armed, And so he climbs down the tree and he starts climbing up this like little rocky outcropping, and he gets up to where this creature was hiding. There's nothing there. There's no scent, there's no anything. And he just decides, you know what? I'm just gonna walk in the general direction that I think this thing went. Because where he was, which was this rocky outcropping, it kind of dead-ended because it's like a cliff. So he could pretty much only go inland and up this mountain. And so he just starts walking. And as he's walking, he's looking for signs that he could potentially attribute to this creature. He's listening really intently, but there's nothing. After about an hour, he's looking at the map and he's looking around at the terrain, and he's like, I think I'm lost. Like, I need to turn around now. And then it dawns on him that he's also lost track of time. It's starting to get pretty dark out, and he does not have a flashlight. So he starts to panic a little bit because he realizes that his curiosity has now put him in a very dangerous situation. He doesn't have supplies to stay the night. He doesn't have a flashlight. It's getting late, and he's potentially lost. So he tries to compose himself, and he just says, okay, I'm just gonna turn around and walk back, because he hasn't seen any indication of this creature or this person or whatever it is. So he turns around and he starts backtracking as best as he can. And as soon as he starts moving back, from behind him, he hears what sounds like a very large tree break and smash into the ground. And he described it as being louder than most guns. Like, it's an extremely loud sound. And he turns around and he looks, and there's nothing there. But he just figured, that's crazy. Like, I'm lucky that no tree landed on me. He's not thinking that could be, Bigfoot. He's thinking that a tree just fell and I'm lucky it didn't land on me. And so now, even though he is not connecting the falling tree with this creature or person he saw, he's in a bit of a panicked state. And so he can't help but associate the experiences. And so he finds himself, as he's walking now a little bit faster and faster away from where he just was, looking over his shoulder in the direction of where that tree fell and where he believed this creature or person was. And as he's walking, looking ahead where he needs to go, but then peering over his head, over his shoulder, over and over again, he hears another loud snap and fall, and it stops him dead in his tracks. It was ahead of him, off to the right, basically on the exact opposite side of where he had come from. And he's thinking to himself, in all the time that I've spent in the woods, it's so rare to be around a tree suddenly falling, unless it's being caused by another tree falling or some other event. It's rare that you would hear two large trees break and fall independent from one another in the same small area but not connected. That's pretty rare. And he's thinking to himself, if that creature or person had anything to do with it, how did it go from over there to all the way over there without me hearing it? It's moving around without me being able to spot it. And so the hair on the back of his neck stands up, and he's starting to feel very uncomfortable. He's being hunted. And so he keeps on walking the path, but begins to veer off away from the second snap that he heard. He figures, I'm just gonna split the difference and kind of go a little bit to the left and avoid that falling tree, still keep my distance from this falling tree, and just get down the mountain as quickly as I can. And so as he starts moving in this kind of slightly new direction, he hears a third falling tree. And now it's back on his left side, closer to that first one he heard, except it's closer to him now. He turned around and he couldn't see the result of a large tree falling. He certainly heard it, but he's looking and he can't see anything. And he's thinking to himself, like, 3 falling trees, that is not innocent. Something is knocking over these trees. And I think it's that creature I saw. And even worse is he's thinking to himself, is this creature using these trees to signal to other creatures where he is? Is he being tracked? It's getting closer to him without giving away its own position. He really believed he was being hunted. And so he starts sprinting down the mountain. And as he's running, he's hearing snap, fall, snap, fall. These massive trees are being knocked down on his left and his right side, like you have 2 hunters basically following him, or it's the same one that apparently can move around in the wilderness without being spotted. And he is absolutely terrified. He's running down the mountain, he's falling, he's getting smashed up every time he falls. And he finally, after about 30 minutes of just running straight downhill with these crashes getting closer and closer and closer to him, he reaches this clearing. And he stops abruptly because there's an animal in the middle of the clearing, and it's a deer. And the deer doesn't seem fazed by Jeff. The deer sees Jeff, looks behind Jeff, just off to his side, and it tilts its head back and then turns and sprints away. It wasn't running from Jeff. It was running from whatever was right behind Jeff. And Jeff stops, and he starts turning his head in the direction of where the deer was looking, and he can't see anything. And as he's looking, another tree slams, smashing down right behind where he was. He takes off sprinting. He knows he's maybe a half mile from his car at this point. And now, as he's sprinting through this field, all he hears is just a cascade of these crashing trees as he sprints the final stretch to his car. He pulls out his key and he starts clicking the automatic locks, and he can't tell if it's working. And he's panicking that it's not going to work in time and he's going to get to his car and it's going to be locked. And he's fumbling with his keys to open the door, and now the crashing has all stopped. And he's just waiting for this thing to jump out and grab him. He manages to open his car, jumps inside, slams it, starts it up, and peels out of there. And then he went back to his office where his sheriff was, and he told him what happened, and he felt ridiculous telling him. And his sheriff was like, I get reports like this all the time. This side of the Cascade Mountains, in that very remote section that you were in, we get reports like that all the time. I believe you. If you want to file a report, go for it, but chances are good it's never going to be followed up with. This is just a phenomenon of being out here in the wilderness. Some people believe it, some people don't. Decades would go by and he would finally share his story, which is why we're hearing about it now. But when he tells that story, if you watch it on Paranormal Witness, you're listening to it like it happened yesterday. This has stuck with this man, and it's clear it had a profound impact on his life. So while there's never been any substantiated claims of Bigfoot actually existing, some of these reports are eerily similar to one another, and some of the people detailing these sightings are people like Jeff, who really has no reason to lie or embellish. He doesn't really stand to gain much. In fact, he stands to lose. because he could be labeled as kind of like a kook for believing that Bigfoot chased him. So the way I like to look at stuff like this is just to keep an open mind. We don't know half the stuff that's in our ocean. You know, we barely know anything in the universe. What's to say that there isn't some creature like Bigfoot that's managed to evade, you know, legitimate proof that it exists? I think it's certainly possible. It doesn't mean that I fundamentally believe it's true. It just means that I retain an open mind. But I want to know what you think chased Jeff through the woods. Was it Bigfoot? Was it something else? Or was this just some hoax? And if it was a hoax, are all the other sightings hoaxes too? And if you haven't already, if you enjoyed this story, if you would please gently disembowel the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads of stories that are like this, strange, dark, and mysterious. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I look forward to reading your comments. If you want to get in touch with September 25th, 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason, the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, "Easy, baby, easy, baby." Then he asks Fox, "What's the damage?" And Fox says, "It's bad, man, we're hit." Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, "We're going down." Air traffic responded, "Okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you." Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, "This is it, baby." Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was, "Brace yourselves." And then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, "I love you, Mom." At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the two pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182. 2015, a tropical storm named Joaquin was swirling off in the Atlantic, and forecasters were having a hard time determining how big it was going to be, how fast it was going to be, and where it was going to end up. On shore, 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson was struggling too. He was supposed to pilot his enormous cargo ship, the El Faro, from where he was in Florida all the way out to Puerto Rico, a 2,600-mile journey that would put he and the rest of his 32-person crew directly in the path of this storm. The year before, Davidson had been passed over for a promotion for a younger, more tech-savvy captain, and so now Davidson felt like he had something to prove. As he looked out over the calm water and the clear sky, he made a fateful decision. Every agency out there was telling him to not set sail until the storm had passed. But with 37 years of experience, Davidson felt differently. He felt like he could outrun this storm. Feeling suddenly motivated and confident, Davidson boarded the El Faro, hopped on the intercom, and informed his crew that they would not be waiting out the storm. Instead, they would be sailing right by it. As El Faro cast off her lines and headed southward, the governors of New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland all declared states of emergency. As the sound of El Faro's diesel engine faded over the horizon, cyclone warnings and hurricane warnings went up around the Bahamas. Schools on the islands began closing, flights were grounded, and cruise ships were diverted. Residents of one island were ordered to evacuate, and on another, police forcibly removed every occupant on this island as floodwater rose. But the first few hours of El Faro's journey were totally uneventful. But as they got closer and closer to the storm, the wind picked up and the waves grew dramatically. By nightfall, the ship was rocking so aggressively side to side that it made sleep almost impossible. By the following morning, the rain was so intense, the visibility was basically zero, and the waves were now so massive that none of the crew dared go out on the deck in fear of being swept overboard. The The ship's navigator told Captain Davidson that he thought this storm was a lot worse than they were expecting, and that they should really consider turning around before it was too late. Davidson and the navigator were not the only ones up on the bridge, which is where the ship is actually steered from. There was also a black box that was anchored up on the wall behind them that recorded all of the conversations that happened up there. And the black box would record increasingly anxious conversations between the crew and Davidson as they voiced their concerns about the storm. But Davidson was totally unfazed. He was adamant that the storm was not going to get any worse than what they were seeing right then and there. And even if it did get worse, they were never going to be actually in the storm's eye, and so they weren't in any real danger. But to reassure his crew, he ordered his navigator to make a slight right so everybody on board saw they were taking a wider berth around the storm. One of the crew members, a 34-year-old woman named Danielle Randolph, was not reassured by this slight right. She was a hard worker from a military family and always followed orders, but she just could not understand why Davidson was not taking the storm seriously. And so that evening, after the sun had set, Danielle very carefully stumbled her way up the stairs to the navigational bridge because the ship is still rocking violently side to side. And when she got up there, she thought she would just check the weather for herself. The black box anchored to the wall recorded her discovery. The El Faro was not going to sidestep the storm. It was sailing directly into it. You can hear the fear and surprise as Danielle turns to Davidson and says, "We're sailing right through the eye." There was a silence on the recording as Davidson must have looked down at the computer screen that Danielle had pulled up to show him the storm and their course that was going right into it. And Davidson, after he realized his mistake, has this very eerily calm tone where he says to the navigator, "Okay, I need you to make another slight right." And he assured everybody on the bridge that that would be enough, that that would fix this mistake. But Danielle was not buying it. And so as professionally and respectfully as she could, she says to her captain, "This is a really bad idea. We really need to turn around right now. It's getting to the point where it's going to be too late and we won't be able to turn around." But Davidson wasn't having it. And so he told Danielle and the navigator and the other people on the bridge that they were not in danger, that everything's just fine. This is just like the storms he had been through when he used to work in Alaska, and they would get through this one too. Davidson was so confident in his decision making that he told them he was going to go take a nap downstairs, and if they really needed him, if something serious happened, go and get him. And with that, he left the bridge and went down to his room. As the minutes of the night ticked by, Danielle stayed up in the bridge and she braced herself against a steel girder and looked out the window at the rain that was just slashing across the window and the waves that were the size of 3-story houses crashing in on either side of them. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sky just stayed totally black because they were right outside the eye of the storm. Suddenly, under their feet, Danielle and the navigator and the other people up on the bridge heard this awful clanging metal sound as the constant rocking of the ship had finally loosened up the straps holding down these massive metal containers down in the cargo hold, and they were now loose, smashing into the inside of the ship. And then they heard an even worse sound, and the black box recorded it too. And that was the shrill of an alarm that meant El Faro was taking on water. Danielle left the window and ran around to the radar screen to see if there was any ships in the area that might be able to help them. But when she looked, there was no blips on the screen. All the other ships had diverted to avoid this storm. El Faro was totally alone. At the sound of the alarm, Davidson came running back up to the bridge, and you hear him on the black box, and he sounds like someone who's acting calm, but there's a tightness in his voice that he's trying to conceal the fact that he's actually probably quite scared. Because at this point, the reality was the El Faro was now too close to the eye of the storm, and they would be unable to escape its grasp. They were going to get pulled into the eye of this hurricane. Furious with her captain, she brushed past him without saying anything, and then very carefully made her way down the stairs to her room. And the whole time she was walking, she would have been barely able to stand, because now with those loose shipping containers down in the cargo hold, the ship would rock even farther to each side, because as soon as it tilted one way, the containers would slam into the wall, driving it even farther into the water. When she finally staggered her way down and got to her door, she would have opened it up and her whole room would have been trashed. Everything that wasn't anchored down had been tossed all over the room, all over her clothes. Any furniture would have been dumped all over the room. But she didn't care about any of her stuff on the ground. She only wanted her laptop. She found it. It was on the ground. She picked it up. She put it on her desk that was bolted down, and very carefully she opened it up and she opened her email. As the alarms are shrieking in the background and she can hear the sound of the shipping containers smashing into the inside of the cargo hold, she writes this note to her mother where she tells her the winds are really bad and it looks like they're sailing right for the center of this storm. And she's about to hit send when she stops for a second. She looks at her computer screen and she adds one more line. Love to everyone. Danielle never said things like this. She was always strictly business. And so for her to put that line was an acknowledgement that this might be the last time she ever talks to her family. Shortly after Danielle hit send on that email, the ship listed hard to one side and then it stayed there. The loose containers down in the cargo hold had finally shifted the ship's center of gravity. Water immediately began pouring into the lower sections of El Faro. Danielle knew it was only a matter of time before the water reached her, and so she leapt out of her room and ran down the hall, which was now sideways. She got to the stairwell and climbed her way up to the bridge. As soon as she got up there, all the people on the bridge were holding onto the center console so they didn't fall up against the wall, and she heard Davidson ordering the navigator to turn the ship into the wind. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort where Davidson believed the wind was so strong it would blow the ship back upright. If this didn't work, the ship was going to sink. And so the navigator began desperately turning the wheel, the lights inside of the bridge began to flicker, and the engines growled and vibrated as it churned, trying desperately to get up and over this enormous wave. But as they were just about to crest the top, the engines completely died and it went silent in the bridge. And so now that El Faro is without power, it's just sitting idle in the middle of the storm, and it's getting smashed by these 3-story high waves, and it begins to force the nose of this giant ship to go under and stay under. Davidson breaks the silence by hitting the emergency beacon that notifies the Coast Guard, and then he screams to everybody on the bridge to go downstairs and wake everyone up. We have to get off this ship. On the black box, a new sound is heard, the abandoned ship alarm. At this point, the black box faintly picks up Davidson screaming from somewhere outside of the bridge for people to get in the rafts, get off the boat, get in the water. By this point, the back of the El Faro would have been off the water and the nose would have been almost pointed straight down. And so Davidson is heard coming back up into the bridge, but at this point, the bridge is sideways. It's looking straight down at the water. And it's clear there is another crew member that is stuck inside of the bridge, and he's yelling out to Davidson, Cap, you gotta help me. And Davidson is trying to find him, and he's yelling for him to come to him. And the man tells him he's stuck, he can't go anywhere, he's a goner. And Davidson, with the final words uttered on this black box, would yell to this man, I'm not leaving you, it's time to come this way. And then the black box would cut out because the black box was now underwater. For 3 days, searchers could not even get close to the El Faro wreckage because of the storm. But when they did finally get there, all they could find were 3 life rings, 2 life rafts, and the starboard lifeboat that had been crushed on both sides. A Coast Guard helicopter found a body floating around some of this wreckage, but when they went down to retrieve it, it slipped under the water. 5 days after El Faro's last frantic plea for help, the Coast Guard declared the ship had sunk and everyone on board had died. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please raise the like button's office chair all the way to the top and then break off the handle. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. 2002, 36-year-old Boyd Taylor was single, he had no children, and he lived with his divorced father, Robert, in a small bungalow in the northern England countryside. In addition to living with his father, Boyd also worked for his father. His father, Robert, owned a small construction business, and so the father-son duo built houses in the area. While Boyd might have envisioned his life turning out in a different, more exciting way, he didn't seem outwardly unhappy about his circumstances. In fact, he seemed very cheerful, both at work and when he was at home. But despite his cheerfulness, his father, Robert, was still pretty concerned about him, because every time Boyd had some time off from work and was just at loose ends, he wouldn't go out with his friends. In fact, he really didn't have any friends and wasn't even trying to make any friends. Instead, he would just sit in his room all day and be totally by himself. Now, Robert knew his son was naturally a bit of a loner and always had been, but a part of him hoped that his son would just start going out and meeting new people or at the very least, develop some sort of hobby that could occupy his mind. In late September of 2002, Robert was walking down the hallway of their bungalow when he passed by his son's bedroom door, and it was shut, and as he walked past, he heard inside of his son's room the sound of his son sawing some wood. And so he stopped for a second and he just listened. And when the sawing stopped for a second, Robert just knocked on the door. He was curious. He wanted to know what his son was doing. Boyd, instead of coming over to the door and opening it up and talking to his dad, instead just paused for a second and then said, "What is it, Dad? What do you need?" And Robert would say, "Well, I heard sawing and I just wanted to know what you were building." And so Boyd pauses again and then just says, "Well, I'm working on a woodworking project." And so Robert's like, "Well, can I poke my head in and actually see what you're building?" And Boyd, again, without opening the door, just tells his dad very politely that he wants to be left alone. And so Robert decides not to push the issue. Whatever he was doing, it was his business. And so he just told his son that, hey, if you need any help with anything, let me know. I'd be glad to help. And then Robert walked away. Over the next 2 months, every time Boyd was not working, so in the evenings and on the weekend, he would be locked inside of his bedroom, hammering and sawing away at this woodworking project. And over those 2 months, Robert would periodically walk down the hall and stand in front of his son's bedroom and knock on the door and try to get his son to let him in to just see what he was up to, not only because he just wanted to see what his son was doing, but because Robert was a carpenter by trade and so was just genuinely interested. But every time he asked to be let in, Boyd would very politely tell his father that he really just wants to be left alone, and Robert respected his wishes. In early December, Boyd approached his father and said, "Hey, would it be possible for me to take the next month off from work so I can focus on this woodworking project?" Now, for Robert, this was a massive inconvenience. This construction business that he owned was really just he and his son building the houses. And so if his son was not going to be working, then Robert would be solo on all of his projects for that month. But Robert's thinking to himself, my son has finally found a hobby that he's really into. I don't really know what it is, but clearly he's invested in it. And so he tells his son, "You know what? That's fine. You take the whole month, and if you want more time in January, that's fine. You just let me know." So starting that first week in December, every time Robert would leave the house to go to work in the morning, he would leave to the sound of Boyd in his bedroom hammering and sawing and tinkering away at his woodworking project. And then several hours later, when Robert finally came back home, he'd walk into the house and the first thing he would hear is his son still in his bedroom, still hammering and sawing away. When December finally ended and Robert expected his son to be done with his project and to finally show him what he's been working on, Boyd approached him and said, "Well, Dad, I'm not quite done with the project. I need about 2 more weeks." And so Robert said, "No problem. We'll talk in 2 weeks." So December rolled into January and Boyd just continued to work all day long inside of his bedroom. Then on the evening of January 7th, Robert was home. He was watching TV in the living room and Boyd was hard at work in his bedroom right down the hall when Robert decided he was tired and he was going to go to bed. So he stands up, turns the TV off, he leaves the living room, he goes down the hallway with his son's room on the right, and as he passed, he can hear his son at work and he kind of yells to his son that he's going to bed. And then Robert goes into his bedroom, crawls into his bed, and falls asleep. At 3:30 a.m. the following morning, Robert is suddenly awoken by this incredibly loud crashing sound somewhere in his house. Robert's first thought was the chimney must have collapsed. That was how loud the sound was. And so he leaps out of his bed, he runs out of his door, he goes down the hallway, past his son's room, into the living room, and he looks at the fireplace, which is in the TV room, and clearly the chimney has not collapsed onto itself. And so he's standing there thinking, what else could that sound have been? And then he's thinking to himself, well, did I really hear that sound, or was that sound in my dream? And I kind of thought it was real, but it really wasn't. And so just to be sure, he walked all around the house, kind of seeing if there were any signs of something big falling and crashing on the ground, but the house seemed totally in order. And so he walked back down the hallway towards his bedroom, and he stopped right outside of his son's room, and he considered knocking and waking his son up to see if maybe he had heard this loud sound too. But when he listened to the door, it was quiet inside, so he figured, what, my son's asleep, I'm not going to wake him up for this. And so Robert just went into his bedroom and he went back to sleep. A few hours later, Robert got up and he left his bedroom, he went into the kitchen and he made himself some food. And as he's preparing his food, he's realizing that he doesn't hear the sound of Boyd working in his bedroom, because normally Boyd would be working that early in the morning, but he wasn't. And so right before Robert left to go to work that day, he actually walked walked down the hall and listened to his son's bedroom to hear if maybe he was at work in there, but he just hadn't heard him. But it was totally silent in the room. And so he reached down to the doorknob, thinking maybe he could just poke his head in and see if his son was on his bed. But when he tried the doorknob, it was locked. So Robert just thought to himself, okay, I guess Boyd is sleeping in this morning, and so I'm not going to bother him. And so Robert leaves the house, he gets into his truck, and he drives off to work. And then several hours later, he comes back to the house at night, and he walks inside, and the first thing he hears is nothing. It's silent. And this house in the evenings for the past several months was never quiet. Boyd was always hammering, sawing, and tinkering away at this woodworking project. And so right away, Robert's thinking to himself, maybe he's done with the project and I can finally see this thing he's been working on. And so Robert drops his stuff at the door and he walks down the hallway. He goes to his son's bedroom door and he knocks and he says, hey, Boyd, are you done with your project? But he's met with silence. And so Robert reaches down again and tries the doorknob, but it's locked. And so Robert's standing there thinking, it's too early for him to be asleep. And so he yells out for Boyd, hey, what's going on? Where are you? I haven't seen you today. Come out here. Come talk to me. But again, it's silent. And so Robert's thinking, okay, well, when I pulled in, was his car in the driveway? And he can't remember. And so he leaves the house, he goes out to the driveway, and sure enough, there's Boyd's car. It's in the driveway. So he has to be here. And so suddenly Robert's starting to feel a little bit panicked about his son. He runs back into the house and he just starts screaming his son's name as he goes room to room into the bathrooms and the other bedrooms to see if he's in there, but he's nowhere to be found. And so operating on a gut instinct, Robert just runs right out to his car. He gets a sledgehammer, comes back in the house, goes down the hallway, and he's standing in front of his son's bedroom door. And one more time, he yells for his son and bangs on the door, tries to get his son's attention. But after once again, there being total silence, he picks up his sledgehammer and begins breaking the door down. And after a couple of swings, he manages to pop off the locking mechanism, the actual doorknob. That gets blown off and he can push the door open and he sees inside the bedroom is empty. There's just a bed and a dresser and there's no Boyd. But in the back right corner of the room, where normally there was like this alcove, basically a segment of his room kind of jutted away from the rest of the space, almost like it was a closet, but with no door on it. Boyd had clearly built a wall and door over that alcove, kind of creating a sort of sub-room within his bedroom. And this door was shut. And so Robert immediately runs over to this new second door. He tries the doorknob, it's locked. He yells for his son, but again, after silence, he picks the sledge up and begins trying to break this door down. And after a few good swings, like the first door, he was able to knock the doorknob off of the door. And then he reached down and he pulled the door open. And what he saw on the other side of this door, inside of this little sub-room, was so far from anything he ever expected that he just stood there in stunned silence. And then eventually reality kind of kicked back in and he ran out of his son's room and he called the police. 3 months earlier, Boyd had decided he wanted to build this very specific device that was invented in 1789. Now, he didn't want his father to know about this device, and so he built that door and wall frame in front of that alcove specifically so he could build this device inside of this new sub-room in privacy. He also always made sure to lock his main bedroom door. So for 3 months, Boyd began constructing this 8-foot tall, 3-foot wide structure inside of the subroom. And once the shell of this device was constructed, he began installing all of its inner workings. These included things like various lengths of wire and clock timers and a jigsaw, which is like an electric saw. And then finally, on January 7th, it was complete. So that night, Boyd blew up an air mattress and he slid it inside of the subroom right underneath this ancient machine he had built. And then after that, he went and locked the main bedroom door. He went into the subroom himself and shut the subroom door and locked that. And then he pulled 12 sleeping pills out of his pocket, swallowed those, and then laid down on this air mattress on his back, looking up at the inner workings of this machine. And then once he was positioned the way he wanted to, he reached over up inside of this machine and he felt around for a button that he had placed. He pressed that button and then he put his hands over his chest and he laid there looking straight up until the sleeping pills kicked in and he fell asleep. That button he pressed right before he passed out from the sleeping pills started a timer, and when that timer went off, it would actually activate this whole device. And so several hours after pressing that button, the timer finally went off at 3:30 a.m. The first thing that happened when this device was activated is the jigsaw, the electric saw, began sawing this wire. Now, the wire had been very intentionally placed against the teeth of this jigsaw, and so it's cutting this wire, and this wire is supporting this weighted down, heavy, angular blade that's pointing straight down. And so as soon as this wire is cut, it releases the blade, and the blade that almost looks like this oversized axe head begins falling straight down this chute, and the chute aims the blade directly onto the front of Boyd's throat. Boyd's woodworking project was a guillotine, and that loud crashing sound that woke Robert up at 3:30 in the morning on January 8th, that was the sound of the blade of this guillotine crashing down and decapitating his son. Even though Boyd did not leave behind a note explaining his actions, it was determined Boyd's death was in fact a suicide, a very complicated and deliberate suicide. Boyd's father and other people involved in this case have come to the conclusion that Boyd was clearly showing signs of depression before he chose to take his own life. And so maybe if Boyd had reached out for help, or if there had been some sort of intervention, his death could have been prevented. And if you or anyone you know is struggling with mental health, remember, you are not alone, no matter how bad it feels. A girl living in the UK was home one night with her mom, and she was in her bedroom and she was flipping through her phone when she gets a text message. The message was coming from a boy she had recently met via Snapchat. He told her to go to her window and look outside because he was right near her apartment. Now, this girl did not know this boy particularly well, so it was very creepy to be told, "I'm on your property." But either way, she went to the window to look. There's no one out there. And it's late, so she can't really tell if maybe he's hiding or something. But she feels really creeped out by this, and she ends up leaving her bedroom and going into her mother's room and tells her mom, "Hey, I'm gonna sleep in here with you tonight." She doesn't tell her mom about the text message. Maybe she was embarrassed. We don't know. So the girl is laying in bed, her mom's asleep, and as she's about to put her phone down and actually go to sleep, she gets another text from this boy.
"I'm in your house."
She immediately wakes her mom up. She shows her mom. Her mom's like, "Oh no." She jumps out of bed. Every light goes on. Runs downstairs to confront this person who's apparently in their apartment, but he's not there. The mother ultimately decides, after not finding anything, that, he's not here. We didn't hear anybody come in the house. The doors are locked, everything's locked. So they did another sweep through the apartment and checked every entrance, locked everything. Let's just go to bed. So they go back into the mother's bedroom, shut and lock the door, and the two of them go to sleep. The next morning, the mother is still sleeping. The girl wakes up a little bit early and she decides to go into her bedroom. As soon as she walked in, she would later tell reporters that immediately she felt like she was being watched. And so she starts doing a cursory check of her small bedroom. She, pulls the door aside, looks behind the door. She opens her closet, pulls her clothes aside, looking around, there's no one in there. And she's thinking to herself, that boy got to my head and I'm psyching myself out. She looks down at her bed, and she used to keep all of her shoes lined up next to her bed. And she was really OCD about how she organized her shoes. And she noticed that one set of shoes was out of place. It was a subtle thing that really only she would be able to recognize. And so she gets down on her knees to rearrange the shoes, and that's when she sees something out of the corner of her eye. Her bed was slightly elevated, and so she had a little bit of a line of sight under the bed as soon as she was kneeling. And under the bed is a face, and it's the face of the boy who had said, "I'm outside your house," and he's the same one who said, "I'm in your house." And he's smiling up at her, and he's clutching his phone, looking at her. She runs out of the room. She runs to her mom's room and says, "He's in there, he's in there." The mother comes barreling in, protective mama coming in. The boy's out from under the bed. The boy, in a panic, runs to the window, pulls it open, and jumps out of the window. The boy would turn out to be Kyle Ravenscroft, and he had very quickly become obsessed with this girl. And he just wanted to be close to her. And so when she got that text message that was, "Hey, come look out your window," he was hiding. And when she went into her mom's room, he could actually see her go into the mom's room, and he climbed up the side of the apartment into the window that was open, shut it, and climbed under the bed, so that when the mother and the daughter were searching the house, he was already in the house. So they locked him into the house. He was ultimately given a very small sentence. I think it was a couple weeks in jail. a fine and some community service. But no matter what the sentence was, I'm sure that girl will have to deal with the trauma of that event for the rest of her life. Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast that lived in Sacramento, California. He loved being out in nature, going hiking and camping, and in fact, he had always wanted to go camping in Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin was actually doing research on areas in Alaska that he could potentially go camping. And he settled on this area called Glacier Bay National Park, which even by Alaskan standards is particularly wild and totally remote. Kevin planned to go camping on his own, so he decided he would need to take a class on how to survive the Alaskan wilderness because he's going to be out there by himself and he's chosen this place that's incredibly rugged. So he actually enrolled and participated in a class teaching you how to go camping in Alaska. Then on September 20th of 1985, he flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska, where he commuted his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he went up and introduced himself to the park rangers that were working there. He told them he'd be over near the Wolf Point area, which was an area right against the water, and he said he was going to be here for about 3 weeks. He planned on leaving on October 10th. So everybody who works there is aware that there's this guy, Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be by himself for almost 3 weeks camping near the water. No one in Kevin's family or any of the park rangers heard from Kevin for the next couple of weeks. But the whole point of this trip was basically to escape reality and go live in nature for a few weeks, so no one's raising any red flags. A few weeks later, on October 8th, which is 2 days before Kevin said he was planning to leave the park, which he told park rangers and they knew he was there, a couple of park rangers were in a boat patrolling some waterways around Wolf Point, which is the area where Kevin was camping. The rangers decided to take a bit of a detour to get inside of Wolf Point and actually check in on Kevin and just see how he was doing, because they knew he was out here by himself. They're making their way down, and as they turned this last corner where they could finally see Kevin's sight, immediately they knew something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent was not in the area that it was supposed to be in. There was kind of a designated spot on the soil where you'd place your tent, but his tent was actually down a few meters on this beach that butted up against his campsite, and some of his gear was outside of his tent. Not strewn everywhere, but outside of his tent, like you had placed it outside. As they're looking at his tent, they realized that the top strut that kind of held the top of the tent together was folded down. It looked like it had broken right in the middle. They called out for Kevin, he was nowhere around, and they kind of rationalized what they saw. They thought, he's leaving in a couple of days. My guess is he's probably preparing his campsite for an exit. Maybe he went out to, go on a day hike or something. I'm sure everything is fine. So they leave and come back the next day just to double check. And when they arrive, there's been no change. The tent is still sitting down on the beach with that strut collapsed. His gear is sitting outside of his tent like his sleeping bag and sleeping pad. It's clear that Kevin has not been to this campsite since the last time they saw him, which was 24 hours earlier. So now they're outright concerned and they decide to launch a search for Kevin. They began flying little airplanes over the area where Kevin's campsite was and the surrounding areas. No sign of Kevin. They brought ground searchers with dogs onto his campsite. They're looking everywhere. No sign of Kevin, but they did discover at his campsite that virtually all of the equipment you would expect to be at a campsite in Alaska of someone who's staying there for a few weeks, well, it was all there. He had his backpack fully packed as if he was going to go on a hike. It had food, it had extra clothes and water. It was all packed right up against a tree. All of his sleeping equipment and his cooking equipment. And oddly, there was lots of food that Kevin still had left at his campsite that was out in the open. And no animals had touched it, which is a complete anomaly. As they began searching the outer areas of his campsite, dogs were able to locate Kevin's boots, his glove liner, and his hat. They were tucked away in this gully about a half mile away from this campsite. That they were not visible to the naked eye. It took dogs finding it to locate these items. After finding these items, the early speculation was it looks like Kevin was attacked by bears or some other predator. But the park rangers, who knew this area extremely well and had seen other bear attacks, said, I don't think this is a bear attack because there's no sign of a death struggle anywhere at his camp. If you get attacked by a big predator, you're going to fight for your life to save yourself. You're going to grab onto things and flail around. It's fairly obvious, and there's none of that. There's also no blood or remains or any indication that someone was hurt in this space. And if an animal had come into this camp and attacked Kevin and eaten Kevin, They certainly would have taken the food that was out and about in the campsite, but none of the food was touched. As the investigation continued, rangers would say how strange it was that no wild animals are coming into this campsite. There's no activity, there's nothing in the area. It's like the animals are staying away from Kevin's campsite. When they couldn't find any sign of Kevin, the investigators went to speak with Kevin's family and asked them, did he have any signs that he was looking to end his own life? Do you have any information you can give us about him? And they said, no, he was really happy, well-adjusted, excited about this trip. He had taken a class to prepare himself for this trip. He told us that he planned on taking a couple day hikes, but no overnights. And he had no plans to meet other people while he was there. He was just looking to be on his own in nature. But after just a few days, they had to call the search off because there was no sign of this guy. He was just gone. Knowing that all of Kevin's gear was still located at his campsite means he did not leave to go on one of those day hikes that he had told his family that he might be going on. Because going into the wilds of Alaska without your gear is a death sentence. So Kevin must have been at his campsite when something horrible happened to him. But we know it wasn't an animal attack because there was no sign of that and no animals were coming near this campsite. So if it wasn't an animal attack, then what was it that caused his tent to shift down to the beach and have his gear strewn about on the sand and have his boots and glove liner and hat be located a half-mile away in some gully? And where's Kevin?
Days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was backbreaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold, and it would get caked to the walls, and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms, and he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed the crowbar, and he headed into this shut down molding room, and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed, and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door, and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors.
They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room, and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. Because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it. And then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt. And then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot, he couldn't have breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the Kayak Molding Company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined £200,000. Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, he was fined £25,000 and sentenced to jail for 9 months.